comrades of In Defense of Reason for letting me share my views about this pertinent topic. Without a long backgrounder, let me start the particular discussion, the topic of which is an introduction, a Marxist introduction to crisis theories. So I will try to keep the presentation as simple as possible because not everyone is a student of political economy or economics. And what we intend to do today is to present a truly radical explanation, radical and scientific explanation of the capitalist crisis. So we must start with the terms involved in the topic today, which is a radical explanation, a radical political economy, and the present crisis. Explaining the terms is important because otherwise we'll be engaging in some kind of pure abstract theory and we will not know what we are talking about. So when we say radical political economy is the political economy which strives to reveal the laws which regulate the capitalist mode of production, and it tries to explain the underlying causes of its recurrent crises resulting in unemployment, in inflation, in anarchy of production and all. So being radical means going to the root of things. Going to the root of things means grasping things by their actual fundamental dynamics. And in that sense, radical political economy, any school of economics, if it has a claim on being radical, it must explain the underlying causes, the laws of motion which govern the capitalist mode of production and its regular phenomena. So that is the first term. What do we mean by radical political economy? The second term is political economy itself. What do we mean by political economy? Because political economy and economics are not the same thing. They are different branches of knowledge, if you will. And political economy in general refers to a mode of economic analysis which locates the economic phenomena within the context of overall social system and political system. I mean contextualizing the economic phenomenon socially and politically, rather than seeing economic phenomena as a result of interaction between atomized entities, atomized individual who is supposed to be hyper rational. It has access to perfect information, it strives to maximize utility. On the other hand, we have perfect firms, hyper rational perfect firms who also have perfect access to perfect knowledge, and they are striving to maximize profit. And these atomized individuals and atomized firms, through their interaction, somehow an equilibrium is generated. So this fable is rejected by classical political economy and Marxist political economy. You can say political economy in general. So that is the basic, a very brief and simplistic definition of what political economy is. Now, a brief note on the history of political economy also is in order here, because if you look at the term political economy, it was widely used till 1870s, which was the beginning of the imperialist era, globally speaking, in the history of capitalism, which refers to the total exhaustion of all the progressive potential of capitalism in general. And the exhaustion of the progressive potential of capitalism in general was also reflected in the discipline of economics. So till 1870s, and it starts from the 18th century, mid-18th century itself. James Stewart used the term political economy in 1767 in his book Inquiry into the Principles of Political Economy. But the use of different terms, that means economics on the one hand and political economy on the other, we can trace it back to the Greek antiquity, where economy related to, or economics related to, the economic behavior or economic decisions taken at the household level, whereas political economy referred to the macroeconomic phenomenon, how a system reproduces itself as a whole. What are the causes of, on the other hand, failure of a system to reproduce itself. So in that sense, you can say that political economy deals with the macroeconomic phenomena, situates it in the overall social and political context, whereas economics, even in the Greek antiquity, referred to the microeconomic behavior of the households, decisions taken at the level of household. After 1870s, the use of political economy slowly declined, not totally disappeared, but it slowly declined. And the reason was the so-called marginalist revolution, the theory of marginal utility, the rise of neoclassical bourgeois economics. The neoclassical bourgeois economics, which is today taught in the curriculum of all universities in economics. So in short, political economy does not fetishize the idea of perfect market, perfect competition, atomized individuals trying to maximize their utility, or perfect firms trying to maximize their profits. From 1970s, the usage of term political economy increases again with the beginning of long recession, which was inaugurated by the collapse of dollar gold standard in 1973, and especially after the long depression, what has been termed as long depression, or the first great depression of the 21st century by the likes of Anwar Sheikh, Michael Roberts, Guglielmo Carceri, etc. The reason of the revival of political economy was implicit in the utter failure of neoclassical economics to explain what was happening in 1973, why this crisis began, what were the fundamental underlying causes of the crisis. Now we come to the third term, crisis. We talked about what do we mean by radical. We also talked about the implications of the term political economy and its difference from economics in general. And the third term is crisis. When we are talking about crisis, we refer to the general failure of the system to reproduce itself. We know that capitalist system faces short-term fluctuations regularly. A process of undershooting and overshooting happens in capitalist economy all the time. I mean, short-term fluctuations in terms of realization crisis, in terms of the failure of the capitalist firms to sell their commodities. But these short-term fluctuations in and by themselves do not lead to a general failure of the system to reproduce itself, because these are post festum counterbalanced by, or you can say disciplined by the market. General crisis refers to a situation where the system is inherently and immanently sick or ill. And when the system is inherently or immanently sick or ill, then virtually anything can inaugurate a crisis. A speculative frenzy by the likes of what was his name? This big speculator, Warren Buffett, or anything can inaugurate. Even COVID can inaugurate a long-term downturn. And when the system is inherently healthy, these short-term fluctuations become the inbuilt rhythm of the system, through which system corrects itself and bounces back. So when we are referring to crisis, we are referring to this general failure of the system to reproduce itself, not the short-term crisis which we become witness to every day in a capitalist system. So this is the first thing that we need to understand while we start our discussion. The second part refers to the question of reproduction. Since we refer to crisis as a general failure of the system to reproduce itself, when we see capitalist system, the first question which comes to our mind is not why the system becomes victim to these recurrent crises. The real question that arises before is that how a system like capitalism is ever able to reproduce itself, because we see a system where different individual commodity producing firms, that is capitalist commodity producing firms, they are producing in an isolated fashion. There is no prior planning or prior estimation of the social needs of society, what goods and services they need to be produced and in what quantity. There is no planning or prior assessment involved. So there is a competition between capitalist firms to maximize their profit. There is a struggle between capitalist firms on the one hand and working class on the other. And capitalism also imposes a competition on the working class among themselves. They compete for better wages and all. And in such an anarchic system, the real question that we need to answer that how such an anarchic system is ever able to reproduce itself. How does it reproduce itself? But the moment we establish the conditions in which the system does reproduce itself or is able to reproduce itself, we also demarcate the conditions in which it fails to reproduce itself. So the analysis of conditions of reproduction is also the analysis of conditions in which the system fails to reproduce itself, or the question of reproduction and the question of crisis are inherently linked. They are a dialectical other of each other. So on this question, how does the system reproduce itself, or how the system is able to reproduce itself when it does, we can divide the history of entire economic thought into three broad categories. The first category is that which believes that the capitalist system can reproduce itself ad infinitum. There are two parts of this first school. One which says that the capitalist system can reproduce itself automatically and smoothly if it is left to its own. That school is the neoclassical economics, or you can term this entire school as a neoclassical economics. One version is which says that the system left to its own, if there is no intervention, then the system is able to reproduce itself automatically and smoothly forever, ad infinitum, infinitely. The other half of this same school is the school of Keynesians. Keynesians also say that the system can reproduce itself, but not automatically and smoothly. It can reproduce itself infinitely, forever, indefinitely, with the proper management, intervention and adjustment by the state. So with the little help from its friend, the state, the system can reproduce itself ad infinitum. So both these schools agree on the basic thing. That basic thing is that there are no historical limits to the capitalist system. One says that the capitalist system can reproduce itself smoothly and automatically without any intervention. If it is left to its own, it will reproduce itself smoothly and automatically. The other says that no, it cannot reproduce itself automatically and smoothly. Left to its own, it can reproduce itself only in a volatile and turbulent fashion. But this volatility and turbulence can be done away with if the state is wise enough to intervene through its policies, adjust the system, manage the system, and if and when the state does so, the system can produce itself smoothly and automatically. So both agree that there are no historical limits to the system. The system can continue forever. One says that without intervention of the state, the other says with the intervention of the state. The second category is that of underconsumptionism. Now there are various kinds of underconsumptionism to which we will come. But this other school is kind of a mirror image of the first tendency. It says that the system cannot reproduce itself. It cannot grow and it cannot expand because it can grow only when there is sufficient, effective demand. If there is sufficient demand in the system and the system inherently is incapable of generating sufficient effective aggregate demand, and therefore in the absence of an external buyer, a third buyer besides workers and capitalists, if there is no external or third buyer, the system cannot reproduce itself, its overproduction cannot be absorbed, and therefore the system will not be able to grow, expand and accumulate. It will become stagnant and eventually it will decline. So that is the basic argument of underconsumptionist school. There are three sub-categories within underconsumptionism. One is reactionary underconsumptionism a la Malthus, Thomas Malthus. The other is reformist underconsumptionism as personified by the likes of Sismondi or Hobson. And there is revolutionary Marxist underconsumptionism, Marxist in double quotes, revolutionary underconsumptionism you can say, which is represented by Rosa Luxemburg in the main, but then also Monthly Review School and others. So they argue that if we, the underconsumptionists, they of all categories, of all types, of all shades, they argue that the system cannot generate sufficient effective demand, and in the lack of an external buyer, the system will stagnate and decline. Malthus said that this external buyer is within the system, within the capitalist society, but outside the capitalist system, capitalist relations of production. So for Malthus, this external or third buyer was the parasitic class of landlords. So he actually supported the existence of these parasitic classes of landlords because they were the factor which enabled the system to absorb its overproduction. Therefore, he kind of presented an apologia for the obscene opulence and luxurious lifestyle of the parasitic classes. He's also infamous for his law of population, but he was also an underconsumptionist. Hobson and Sismondi says that there are differences between Sismondi and Hobson. Sismondi is more focused on the contradictions of the system, Hobson not so much, but both agree that if the wages of the working class are increased in the case of Sismondi, and if in the case of Hobson, apart from increasing the wages of the workers, we also redistribute wealth through progressive taxation, then we can be able to generate sufficient demand. Rosa Luxemburg said that this third buyer or external buyer is the non-capitalist periphery, other countries which are still pre-capitalist, especially the countries which are colonies and semi-colonies. And the problem of this glut or this overproduction in the capitalist economies will be resolved by colonies and semi-colonies, which will be net buyer from the advanced capitalist economies. But the contradiction is that as soon as advanced capitalism interacts with this non-capitalist periphery, the pre-capitalist modes of production disintegrate in the non-capitalist periphery, and they also become capitalist, and therefore capitalism kills the golden goose. This non-capitalist periphery shrinks, and the element of resolution of the problem of overproduction, it slowly diminishes, and therefore capitalism reaches a point of final breakdown. That is what we call the final breakdown theory of Rosa Luxemburg's underconsumptionism. So we'll discuss all these things in detail, but right now we come to the third category, which is of Marxist explanation of the crisis, which says that the system can grow under certain conditions. So it doesn't say that system will grow, the system will be able to accumulate ad infinitum. It says under certain conditions the system can grow, but as accumulation progresses, the constitutive contradictions of capitalism, they sharpen and they lead to recurrent crisis. So the historical limits to capitalist system are not external to the system, they are immanent to the system, they are internal to the system. The very barrier to accumulation of capital is capital itself. As capital accumulation progresses, it meets this unmovable barrier, which is capital itself. So for Marxism, the contradictions of capitalism sharpen, they become deeper, they become more structural, as accumulation progresses, and due to this, capitalist system is prone, as a matter of law, to recurrent crises. So that is the basic outline of Marxist theory, but Marxist theory of crisis itself can be divided into two broad categories. One which focuses, like Marx and Lenin, on the tendential fall of the rate of profit, the law of tendential fall of the rate of profit, average rate of profit, or LTFRP. We will refer to this law as LTFRP, law of tendential fall in the rate of profit. And the other is called profit squeeze theories, which basically argue that it is the increase in the wages of the workers which lead to a situation where profitability is squeezed, and that leads to the crisis of profitability. Both agree that it is the crisis of profitability which is the underlying cause of this cyclical recurrent crisis, but the classical Marxist position focuses on the internal contradictions of capitalism, the very dynamics of capital accumulation which leads to this situation, whereas the profit squeeze theorists argue that the class struggle by workers to increase their wages leads to the crisis of capitalism. We'll come to these two schools also in detail. But first, let's discuss the first school, which is the neoclassical school, because that is the dominant orthodoxy in all economics curriculum. It is taught in every college, every university all over the world. So the neoclassical tradition, it comes from the laissez-faire tradition of the late 18th century itself. It is based on taking one element from Adam Smith's hidden hand dynamics theory, that market is a self-regulating mechanism, it automatically produces equilibrium, and it develops it to irrational conclusions. So in a one way it takes its cue from Adam Smith, but it totally abandons classical political economy of Adam Smith and reaches a conclusion which Adam Smith himself never intended to. What they say is a very familiar story. It goes something like this. Every economics textbook, neoclassical economics textbook's first chapter starts with this, that human greed for gains and human need, they are insatiable because they are unlimited. On the other hand, the natural resources, they are limited. And this greed for private gains or private profit is human nature. So the nature of capital, or this nature of capital for insatiable greeds for profit, is imputed upon human beings and turned into human nature. So the nature of capital becomes human nature. Once that is done, we are faced with a irresolvable conflict between human nature and physical nature. And since human nature is like that, an insatiable greed for profit, private gain, the most suited system is capitalism, because capitalism gives freest expression to this human nature, this unlimited, unhindered, insatiable greed for benefit and private gain. So it is in congruence with the intrinsic human nature, and therefore it is the eternal solution to this conflict between human nature and physical nature. And capitalism, as this eternal system, is able to reproduce itself indefinitely as long as human nature itself undergoes some kind of mutation or the physical nature itself is destroyed. And here we can hear the resonance of the bourgeois ideology, which is being sold to us through the culture, industry and ideological state apparatus of capitalism. As Slavoj Zizek rightly says that, or if you look at these many apocalyptic movies, the basic refrain is that you are not allowed to imagine the end of capitalism. You are allowed to imagine the end of planet, but you are not allowed to imagine the end of capitalism. So unless and until either the physical nature itself is destroyed or human nature itself undergoes some kind of mutation, capitalism is the most natural system. So the basic idea of neoclassical economics is to naturalize the capitalist system as the end of history. It is the end of history. It is the best we can achieve. It is the best we can hope for, because it is in congruence with the intrinsic human nature, which in turn is nothing but this insatiable, unlimited, unhindered greed for private gain and private profit. Now, any scientific anthropologist will tell you that this kind of human nature emerges at a particular point in human history. This desire to accumulate is not something biological. It's historical and social. It came into existence at a particular time in history, but we'll talk about that later. And for this justification, this whole, fable of perfect firms, perfect individuals, perfect competition, firms who have access to perfect information based on their perfect estimation or expectations of profit, they are trying to maximize their profit. On the other hand, we have consumers who are trying to maximize their utility, the surplus happiness, the surplus jouissance in terms of Lacan. And this is how the system, somehow interaction of these atomized factors produces and reproduces equilibrium ad infinitum. That's the neoliberal parable or fable. But as soon as you come out of the economics classrooms and economics textbooks and come to the real world, you find that none of this actually exists. Real world and real capitalist economy functions in a totally different way, and that is why all the neoclassical economists have hard time explaining the actual empirical data, actual empirical or historical experience of capitalist mode of production through ages. The real empirical data regarding the capitalist economy, it shows that the capitalist world regularly faces crisis, even when there was no systematic state intervention. For example, in the early stages of capitalism, it was victim to recurrent cyclical crises, and even neoclassical economics like Wesley Clare Mitchell, who is a business school theorist, he has counted 15 major crises between 1820, which is the first recorded capitalist crisis, and 1910. After 1920, in the late 1920s, Great Depression started, which lasted for more than a decade. Then there was Second World War. Second World War led to large-scale destruction of productive forces in Europe and Japan in particular, and that led to a long boom, what has been called the golden era of capitalism, fueled by the reconstruction of Japan and Europe after the Second World War. And that also came to an end by the end of 1960s. 1967 was the high point. After that, even neoclassical economists agree that the average rate of profit went down and steadily went down. And then in the early 1970s, it took a sudden dip with the collapse of dollar gold standard, which was only a manifestation of the crisis of profitability, and then OPEC oil crisis, which had political reasons also. But then, even during this long boom, one of the most celebrated neoclassical economist, Nobel laureate, Paul Samuelson, he talks about 7 major recessions, even during the long boom, between 1945 and 1975. Samuelson talks about 7 major recessions. And since 1970s, we have been witness to what has been called long recession, a period of long, mild recession, where, and it continues to this day, when the growth rates of real productive economy has not yet matched the pre-1967 levels. And we are becoming witness to a long, protracted period, a secular period of downturn, mild recession, peppered with three things you can say. One, very small and insignificant periods of boom in the real productive economy. For example, between mid 1970s and early 1980s, when due to the beginning of neoliberal policies, attacks on the rights of workers, attacks on the wages of workers, depression of average wages, there was a period of real boom in the capitalist economy. This period precisely is the period of Thatcherism and Reaganomics. But 1982 again is the last year when this real boom ends decisively and definitively. And from then on, we have become witness to two things. One is fictitious boom, or boom created by speculative frenzy initiated by fictitious capital, share market, casino economy booms, or periods of serious depression like 1982, 1987, 1992-93, 1996-97, the crisis of Asian tigers, and then the three major bubbles before subprime bubble, the housing bubble, dot-com bubble, and one more, I'm forgetting its name. So that happens during the last years of the 20th century and early 2000s. It is also called the early 2000s recession. And then we come to what Anwar Shaikh calls the first Great Depression of the 21st century, which has also been called Long Depression by Michael Roberts, and rightly so. And since 2008, 2007-8, this Long Depression is continuing because there has been no proper revival. You can compare the world economy as a patient lying on its deathbed on the verge of falling into coma, and Coramin injections of speculative bubbles are given to it, and the patient wakes up in a state from its vegetative state into a state of delirium and then falls back. That's what we have been witnessing since the last 15-16 years. So this whole process or history of capitalism, the neoclassical economics is unable to explain, and the real experience of capitalist world, therefore, it trashes all these ideological stories about the smooth and automatic reproduction of capitalist system on its own. Now, once you argue that the system can reproduce itself automatically and smoothly, when you are faced with real crises again and again, you have only two options, two methods or ways to explain why crisis happens. One is called the smoking neighbor analogy, where they say that system in principle, the neoclassical economists say that in principle the system indeed can reproduce itself smoothly and automatically, but due to some exogenous and external factors, crises happen regularly, and these are contingent factors, exogenous factors, accidental factors. Why smoking neighbor? That the system doesn't itself smoke, but the neighbor smokes, so there is passive smoking, and due to passive smoking the system falls ill. That's what the smoking neighbor metaphor is. So one explanation is these are always contingent and exogenous factors which lead to crisis. The other is even more laughable. It is a psychological explanation which says that human psychology itself by nature is turbulent, and it is characterized by waves of despair and optimism. When there is a wave of, from where these waves come, we don't know. But due to these waves of, cycles of waves of despair and optimism, during the waves of despair, people tend to save more, buy less, spend less, etc., etc. And due to that there is a downturn. And during the period of optimism, people have this propensity to spend more and live a luxurious life, eat, drink and be merry. And that is why even the bourgeois politicians believe in that actually. It's not like it's a conspiracy theory that bourgeoisie has created a fable for us. That's not how ideology functions. They actually believe in it. And that is why when crisis hit, I think Obama was president at that time, 2007-8, and he said that I asked the Americans to spend their way out of recession. So spend more. But it's not about what the president says, and it's also not about the cycles of despair and optimism. So both these explanations they are not even explanations. They don't even come near to anything which has a semblance of an explanation, because the crises are, too punctual, too recurrent, and too stubborn to be explained away by, these kinds of interpretations or explanations. So a third school also emerged, on a footnote I can say. It is called the business cycle school. Business cycle school says that the system does have short-term fluctuations, but the system still reproduces itself smoothly and automatically. In fact, the very process of smooth and automatic reproduction of system, there is an inbuilt rhythm of ups and downs, short-term ups and downs and fluctuations. And it doesn't prove that system cannot reproduce itself smoothly and automatically. In fact, that is how the system produces itself automatically and smoothly. But they also did not touch the periods, of secular stagnation and crisis. Whenever the business cycle theorists were faced with the demand to explain the long downturns or, very punctual and recurrent, stubborn periods of crisis, they again fell back on these two explanations. So natural factors, for exogenous factors like natural factors of famine hits, there is a flood, there is an earthquake, there is a sunspot or something like that, then crisis occurs, or human psychology, waves of despair and optimism. So business cycle theorists also tried to explain, somehow accommodate these, the movements of system as a whole by saying that yes, there are short-term fluctuations, but the system still reproduces itself smoothly and automatically, and this is how the system reproduces itself smoothly and automatically. But within the neoclassical orthodoxy, business cycle school never occupied a central, place. Why? Because it conceded too much to radical explanations. To accept that the system does have fluctuations and ups and downs, it posed a threat to the basic neoclassical prejudice that the system is perfect, the firms are perfect, the consumers are perfect, automatic equilibrium is always produced and reproduced. There was a threat to this because they were accepting some things, and it didn't, bode well with the orthodox neoclassicals. So all of these explanations, neoclassical, the business cycle theorists, they did try to, render their yeoman service to capitalism, but they failed. Business cycle theorists re-emerged and occupied a central position with the rise of Keynesianism. Now, Great Depression totally shattered the neoclassical mythical representation of capitalist system, because even in 1929 was the beginning of Great Depression, and even in 1939 there were 10 million unemployed people in the US. The economies were still, and the situation in France and Britain was also not very different from that. High levels of unemployment, declining rates of profit. So after 10 years, the system was not able to bounce back. This created serious problems for neoclassical explanations, and there comes the messiah of people like Prabhat Patnaik, Jayati Ghosh, C.P. Chandrasekhar, etc., the JNU school of political economy, ostensibly Marxist, really a very poor and pauper blend of underconsumptionism, post-Keynesianism of Kaleski and Steindl, and underconsumptionism basically. So enter Keynes, and Keynes kind of rescues bourgeois orthodox economics from this crisis, this embarrassing situation in which the bourgeois economics was finding itself during the Great Depression. So Keynes says that capitalist system cannot reproduce itself smoothly and automatically if it's left on its own, and he attacks J.B. Say's infamous law that supply creates its own demand. Production creates its own markets automatically. So he says, no, it doesn't. Supply doesn't create its own demand, because reproduction is by nature volatile in capitalism, because the investments, they are based on violent and volatile expectations of profit on the part of capitalists, which he terms what he calls animal spirit of the capitalist. So these volatile and violent expectations of profit, they disable the capitalist system as a matter of rule to optimally absorb the productive capacity of the system, which is means of production produced by the system, and absorb the labor supply. So the system left on its own cannot lead to optimal absorption of means of production and labor supply, and therefore it cannot reach a situation of near full employment unless and until the state intervenes. If the state intervenes, then the system can reproduce itself smoothly, not automatically, but it can reproduce itself smoothly. How? It can reproduce itself by a particular kind of state policy based on spurring the aggregate demand through deficit spending. And he attacks the old theories which say that deficit spending, that is minting too much money, would lead to inflation. He says no, it doesn't, unless and until we reach the throughput limit of labor supply. So unless and until the labor supply itself runs out, the state is free to do deficit spending and give impetus to aggregate domestic demand. Deficit spending will lead to inflationary pressures only when the stage of near full employment is already reached. Then minting too much money, deficit spending, will lead to inflation. So basically he says that if the state can increase the effective aggregate demand, it will spur the rate of investment. Rate of investment increases, the means of production and labor supply is absorbed, a situation of near full employment is reached, and then the system can reproduce itself smoothly. So with the proper management and adjustment by the state through its macroeconomic policies, the system can reproduce itself. Now, as we can see, Keynes shares the basic ideological prejudices of the neoclassical school. For example, the society is divided not into classes but producers and consumers. Supply and demand rules supreme. Equilibrium analysis is there. Equilibrium analysis in the sense that there is an assumption that there can be a static equilibrium in capitalist economy. Whereas what we actually see in capitalist economy is a turbulent equilibration, not a static equilibrium. So Keynes shares all the basic tenets of neoclassical theory with one caveat, that the interaction of all these factors does not automatically produce equilibrium. There is an essential need for the intervention of state, and if that happens, then there is no problem. So due to these, a part of the neoclassical orthodoxy, I am saying neoclassical orthodoxy because for me Keynes is part of neoclassical tradition itself. Keynes is not radical political economist as many people argue. Anwar Sheikh also says that, but I think there are obligations when you are teaching in New York School of what is it called? New School in New York University. Then you can't say that you can't reject Keynes, right away. You have to say, nahi, kuch to sahi bolta hai Keynes bhi. So that is why actually, if you read between the lines, Anwar Sheikh is saying that Keynes is part of neoclassical tradition, and he's totally correct. So that is why even a part of neoclassical orthodoxy co-opted Keynes, it accommodated Keynes, because Keynes, at the end of the day, I was saying that system can reproduce itself. There are no historical limits to capitalist system which are immanent or inherent, inbuilt within the dynamics of capitalist system. So of course he was not, this neoclassical orthodoxy was not that allergic to Keynes. In fact, he was welcomed after the Great Depression hit. So if you argue like that, then every crisis, of course, is a policy failure. So every crisis in capitalism is always explained as a policy failure on the part of the state by Keynesians. And this is where business school theorists also are given, their due place within the bourgeois economics, because for proper policy intervention by the state, the fluctuations of the system have to be studied. The neoclassical orthodoxy pushed business cycle theorists on the margins of neoclassical school, because, as I said earlier, they were conceding too much. But for Keynes, business cycle theorists were welcome, because for proper policy intervention, the study of short-term fluctuations was necessary. So business cycle theorists were also kind of accommodated within the Keynesian school. But then 1973 crisis began, and this brought a lot of embarrassment for Keynesians, because Keynesians argued that system can reproduce itself without intervention of the state only with persistent unemployment or persistent inflation. So they were saying that unemployment and inflation cannot coexist, because inflation meant decline in the aggregate demand. If demand goes down, then the prices will go down for the supply that is available there. But 1973 crisis has been called the crisis of stagflation, where high unemployment and high inflationary pressures and stagnation coexisted. Stagnation and inflation. This the Keynesians failed to explain, because that is like the most important law of Keynesian economics. That is, you might have heard about the Phillips curve, which says that if the employment increases, only then, or you can say, in the same rate in which rate of employment increases, prices increase in the same rate, because rate of employment increases, increase in domestic demand, effective demand, and increase in prices, because vis-a-vis supply, the demand is increasing. Relative to supply, the demand is increasing. So Keynesians tried to come up with new models of Phillips curve. They tried every intellectual acrobatics to accommodate this new development, which was completely new. There was no way to explain it from the Keynesian paradigm, but they failed miserably. It led to the revival of two things. One new version of neoclassical economics, represented by Milton Friedman, who said that there is a natural rate of unemployment, and that natural rate is the result of the fact that there are people who just don't want to do work. So they don't look for work. So the natural rate of employment is reflective of that population, and on a proper wage, everyone willing to work can be employed by capitalism. That's what, and he got a Nobel Prize for this, Milton Friedman. But when you can propose the leaders of settlers for Nobel Peace Prize, what's her name? That demonic lady from Israel? No. Daniela Weiss, yeah. Daniela Weiss. Some people have proposed her name for Nobel Peace Prize. Yes, that's true. Believe it or not. Irfan Khan ke shabdon mein mano ya na mano. That's true. So then anything can happen. There is a politics of Nobel Prize that everybody knows. So the first thing was, with the collapse of Keynesian paradigm, the first thing was revival of new version of neoclassical economics, even more obscene ideologically speaking than its previous versions. And the other was revival of Marxist political economy. This was the golden period of Marxist political economy. You have John Weeks, you have Alan Freeman, Andrew Kleiman, Anwar Sheikh, all these brilliant Marxist political economists who did actual empirical work, which is available online also, you can refer to it. So this is how the Keynesian paradigm collapsed. So this was the first category of neoclassical school, one orthodox neoclassical school, the other is Keynesian neoclassical school. The second school is the school of underconsumptionism, which is at least as old as neoclassical economics, and as I said earlier, it is a mirror image of the neoclassical school. They argue that the system cannot reproduce itself because it is inherently incapable of reproduction. They share different types of underconsumptionists, including Malthus, Rosa Luxemburg, Hobson, Monthly Review. All of them share one basic prejudice, one basic assumption, which is that in capitalism, production happens for consumption. That is the cornerstone of all shades of underconsumption. That in capitalism, production happens for consumption. Then they argue that since production happens for consumption, capitalism must be able to generate sufficient effective demand. But capitalism is inherently incapable of generating sufficient effective demand, that is, demand backed by money, because capitalism recognizes only one demand. What I want or what I need doesn't mean anything unless and until my want or my demand is backed by purchasing capacity. Demand backed by purchasing capacity is effective demand. So capitalism, they argue, the underconsumptionists, is inherently incapable of generating sufficient effective demand, and therefore it cannot accumulate, it cannot self-expand, it cannot reproduce itself therefore, and it is doomed to stagnation and decline if there is no external or third buyer. Third, because the first is capitalist, second is working class, third buyer. In the absence of this third buyer, capitalism cannot accumulate, cannot expand, and it is doomed to collapse eventually. And this external buyer for different kinds of underconsumptionists is different. In fact, this is precisely the basis of classifying underconsumptionists of different kind or different schools into different categories. For, as I said, for reactionary underconsumptionists like Malthus, the external buyer is within the capitalist society but outside the capitalist system, insofar as its form of income is neither profit nor wages, it is rent. We will see that it is not external because rent itself is a derivative of either surplus value or deduction from wages, depending on the relative balance of class forces. For example, MSP is absolute rent. If the working class is not able to organize properly and raise its wages in order to meet the higher prices of wage goods, then higher rent means deduction from wages. And if the working class able to organize and increase its wages in order to meet the higher prices of wage goods, then it is deduction. It is transfer of value from entrepreneurial capitalist class to the landlord class. We cannot go into that, but bottom line is simply this: rent is a derivative form of income. It is not an independent form of income. It is a flow of income, which either regular flow of income, which either stems from the produced surplus value, so it's a distribution of surplus value into profit and rent, or together with this it can also lead to deduction from wages. So all other forms are actually, so as Malthus thought that these are external buyer, they were not actually external buyer, they are not actually external buyer, but that's what Malthus thought. So to all underconsumptionists, the one concept, if we understand that one concept, we understand underconsumptionism of all categories. That one concept is the concept of demand gap. That is shared by all underconsumptionists. So in order to understand this concept, we will spend a few minutes on this because that is central to our discussion and the arguments that we'll present later in the presentation. We can do this in a stepwise fashion, the process of understanding the concept of demand gap. In order to understand this concept, first you have to divide the production into two broad departments. One is department 1, which produces the means of production or producer goods, and department 2, which produces the means of consumption or consumption goods. Now the basic assumption of underconsumptionists is that department 1, which produces means of production or producer goods, it is vertically integrated to department 2 in a subordinate fashion. What does that mean? It means that for all underconsumptionists, the demand for producer goods is a derivative of the demand for consumer goods. So all demand for department 1 originates in department 2. All demand for means of production is originating in department which is producing consumption goods. So means of production, they are produced only in order to supply the industries in department 2 and their demand for producer goods. So it is vertically integrated with the department 2 in a subordinate fashion. Basic idea is the same. Consumption is the regulator of production under capitalism. In other words, in capitalism, production happens for consumption. Therefore, note here that they are not saying that department 2 influences department 1. They are saying that department 2 regulates and determines department 1. They say that even when department 1 capitalists are selling and buying among themselves, for example, if I am a capitalist in department 1 who produces a means of production which produce means of production, even then the logical series ends at department 2. So all demands in department 1 originates in department 2, and therefore department 2 is subordinated to department 1 is subordinated to department 2, or production happens for consumption. Department producing producer goods is subordinated to department producing consumer goods. That is the first thing. The second point that we need to understand in order to understand the concept of demand gap is that the total social product at any given point in a capitalist economy, it consists of two parts. One is replacement product and the other is net product. Replacement product is the product which is used to replenish the spent means of production, because reproduction can continue only then. If production has to happen as a process continuously, production and reproduction, then on the one hand you have to fulfill the demand for consumption, but you have to fulfill the demand for production goods that have been spent in the process of production. Without that, production cannot continue. So total social product at any given point in a capitalist system consists of these two parts. One is replacement product, the other is net product, the product over and above replacement product. The net product again is divided into two parts. One is the necessary product, the product which is consumed by the workers, backed by the workers, and surplus product which is bought by the capitalists. So total social product divided into replacement product and net product, and the net product further divided into necessary product which goes into the consumption of workers and surplus product which goes into the consumption of capitalists. Third point, parallel to this, the total income in society can be divided into fixed, what the capitalist economists or political economists call fixed capital, but actually they confuse fixed capital and constant capital. Constant capital which goes into replacing the spent up means of production. Over and above that fixed capital or constant capital, there is net income, what in bourgeois national accounts is called net national income, NNI. This net national income is further divided into wages and profits. Wages go into the consumption of workers and profits go into the consumption and new investments of capitalists. So we have the fourth point, we have two sides of net production. One is supply side, which is the net product, and one is demand side, which is the net income. So total production of society, one side, the supply side, the products, all goods and services, including producer goods and consumer goods, and the other side is net income, which is divided into wages and profits. And this is precisely this exchange, proportionality of which ensures the smooth reproduction system. So then once we have understand these four things, we come to the basic paradox of underconsumption, which is very simple. It says that workers spend all of their wages for their consumption because they have to. They can't save in a systematic manner. Workers are systematically kept in a situation where they have to, as a social average, they have to spend all of their wages for their consumption needs. So they buy back their part of the net product by using their wages, spending their wages. But the capitalists do not spend all of their profits on buying back their part of the net product, because the mutual competition among capitalists ensures that they have to accumulate capital. Why? Because the competition among capitalists is the competition for the larger share of the market, or price competition basically. And in order to beat your competitor in the price competition, you have to lower your costs. This is very simple, even neoclassicals agree with that. In order to lower the per unit cost, you save and invest later in increasing the productivity of labor by introducing new technology and machinery. So the capitalists save, and they are obliged to save. It is not as if they think that by saving we are leading to crisis, so let's decide collectively that we won't save, we won't accumulate. It can't happen, because in capitalism it is not capitalists who rule capital, it is capital which rules capitalists. So it is inbuilt or inscribed into the very dynamics of capitalism that capitalists have to save, they have to accumulate, otherwise they cannot, it's a competitive system, they cannot beat their competitors. And this necessarily creates a demand gap, because capitalists are not spending their part of the national income to buy back their part of the net product, and this creates a demand gap. Some of the net product remains unsold, and this demand gap is a necessary phenomenon of capitalist system. Earlier underconsumptionists, the early underconsumptionists, they believed that the net product consists only of consumer goods like Malthus, but later underconsumptionists agreed that net product consists of both consumer goods and producer goods, but this does not bring any change in the basic argument. Demand gap is created as a matter of law in capitalism. Now, this demand gap can be fulfilled only if capitalists spend all their profits on consumption. But then capitalism cannot self-expand. Expanded reproduction cannot be undertaken, accumulation cannot happen, system becomes stagnant and eventually declines. How is this problem supposed to be resolved? Through an external buyer. If you have an external buyer who can fulfill this demand gap, then capitalist system can reproduce itself. This external buyer, as I said, can be an internal parasitic class which is supposedly out of capitalist relations of production, or it can be resolved by increasing the wages of workers to an extent that they can buy back more than their wages, so that you implement higher wages, minimum wages, and you implement progressive taxation. Through progressive taxation, you undertake a redistribution of capitalist wealth into different sections of the masses and workers, and they will buy back that extra unabsorbed, overproduced goods and services. The third is Rosa Luxemburg. she says that the third buyer is basically non-capitalist periphery. So based on who is this external buyer, we can divide underconsumptionist school into three sub-parts. One is reactionary underconsumptionism. Malthus, as I said, Malthus, just like all underconsumptionists, said that capitalism is not doomed to fail if we have a sustainable rate of growth. What did he mean by sustainable rate of growth? Not too much saving and not too much accumulation. But what is this not too much accumulation and not too much saving? Because if you go to the argument, any amount of saving will lead to demand gap. So there was a logical anomaly in the argument of Malthus, just like all other underconsumptionists. So he said that capitalists would accumulate, creating a demand gap. This demand gap can be filled by the parasitic classes, so we need to save the aristocratic landlord class and usurers who are interest bearing capital and rent seeking class, and through their luxury and obscene opulence we can fulfill this demand gap. So he creates an apologia for this class of parasitic landlords and usurers. Then comes reformist underconsumptionism. As I said, its trailblazer was Simondi di Sismondi. Sismondi said that workers' wages are generally depressed below the value of their labor power. They get too low wages, and the solution is increasing their wages. Big scale production is a problem. We should return to small scale petty commodity production, then the problem will be resolved. So there was a kind of an economic romanticism inherent in Sismondi's position. Lenin actually wrote a booklet about Russian populists, where he discusses Sismondi in detail, a characterization of economic romanticism. Excellent little book, very accessible, very easy, very simply written. It gives you the basic idea of what Sismondi is saying. So he's saying that wages are not sufficient to fulfill the demand gap. If wages are increased, then this demand gap can be filled. And he also opposed those who said that foreign trade can fulfill this demand, because he says that all capitalist countries, they are involved in the foreign trade at the international level. All cannot be winners. So some will be losers. So as a whole in world capitalism, the problem of demand gap cannot be resolved, because trading, not all traders can be net sellers. It is not who are they selling to. Not all traders can be net sellers. On the basis of that, he said that foreign trade cannot resolve this crisis. So Sismondi's position was basically this. Now we can fast forward from the first part of the 20th century to the 19th century, first half of the 19th century to the end of 19th century and beginning of 20th century. During this period, the foreign investments of all the northwestern capitalist countries, it increased by 700%. This was the period of imperialism, and during the period of imperialism, colonization, the existence of colonies and semi-colonies, the imperialist wars, all of that was happening. And here John A. Hobson enters, and he says that he uses the underconsumptionist argument to explain the origins of imperialism. He says, why is there imperialism? Why is there wars? Why is there existence of colonies and semi-colonies in general? Why is there imperialism? Because advanced capitalist countries, in order to sell their overproduced commodities, they need colonies and semi-colonies. And their overproduced commodities can be sold only there. So imperialism is a result of this demand gap itself, which is created from the inherent motion of capitalist mode of production, and imperialism is a way to resolve this problem. And he says there is no need to do that if you listen to me. Hobson says that. And he says that if you listen to two prescriptions that I am putting forth, we can have a peaceful, humane world capitalism where there is no imperialism, no wars, no colonial loot and plunder. We need to do two things: increase the wages and progressive taxation. You increase the wages of the workers, you introduce progressive taxation to redistribute wealth in such a manner that aggregate demand is created within system, and then there will be no need for imperialism. So his prescription was basically a reformist prescription. He was the first one who came up with the idea of economic surplus, which is not surplus value or surplus product. It is the money value of net production over and above the strict costs of production. So he says that the strict costs of production, once they are fulfilled or completed, all that remain is economic surplus. For that economic surplus, demand cannot be generated by capitalism if my prescriptions are not adopted and implemented. And this idea of economic surplus was taken by Rosa Luxemburg and Monthly Review School. Even though they did not glean the same political conclusions, they said that there is no way capitalism can survive forever, and no reformist solution of the problem can relieve capitalism of this problem, because capitalism will need colonies and semi-colonies to absorb its overproduced commodities, and therefore it will lead to final collapse of world capitalist system. Anyhow, so these are the three categories of the third category is Rosa Luxemburg's category, to which we'll come a little bit late. Before that, in order to move chronologically, we should see how Marxists responded to underconsumptionism. So Marx and Lenin totally destroyed underconsumptionist argument, and there was a school which misused or misappropriated Marx's argument against underconsumptionism to argue for the possibility of a planned and organized capitalism, which will enable capitalism to reproduce itself indefinitely. That school was called Harmonist school. We will shortly discuss these two things, because only then we can understand from where Rosa Luxemburg was coming. So Marx and Lenin responded to underconsumptionism, and their argument was very simple. The first point that Marx put forth was that total social product in society at any point of time consists of both producer goods and consumer goods. Second point is that effective demand, even for underconsumptionists, it originates from three sources. One is, you can call replacement demand or constant capital, which is used to buy spent up means of production. That is one source of effective demand. The other source of effective demand is wages, workers' wages, who buy consumption goods, wage goods mainly, by spending their wages completely. And profits is the third source of effective demand, that is demand for consumer goods by capitalists as well as producer goods by the new investments undertaken by capitalists. Now these three types of demands, one replacement demand, two wages, and third or fixed capital, constant capital, wages, profits. They should ideally fulfill the demand gap in order to realize the total social product. Marx says what the underconsumptionists don't understand is the element of time. He says that the workers and capitalists buy not from the current cycle of production, because current cycle of production is not yet complete. They buy from the previous cycle of production. Now we know the turnovers of different capitals overlap. There is an element of simultaneity and seriality, so partial overlapping of turnover periods of different capital, but we don't need to go into that, because even then you can calculate the average turnover period of total social aggregate capital. How it is done is not the topic of today's discussion, but the point Marx is making, that workers and capitalists buy from previous cycle of production, the total social product of the previous cycle, not the current cycle. So he says that the effective demand for all this net product can be generated if sufficient new investments are undertaken by the capitalist in the current cycle. Right? So if the rate of investment is increasing in the current cycle vis-a-vis the previous cycle, then there will be additional demand for producer goods, and there will be additional demand for consumption goods, because new workers will be hired by new investment. Not in the same ratio, because organic composition also increases. So per unit employment, per unit capital, the employment of worker decreases, but as a social aggregate, employment of workers increases if accumulation is happening. But we are assuming that accumulation is happening. If rate of investment is increasing, then capitalism can. Marx doesn't say that it will. He says that it can generate sufficient effective demand to realize the net product of the previous cycle of production. Right? So the underconsumptionists miss the element of time in the process of production, and they are trying to analyze something which can be analyzed at the level of many capitals, competition at the level of one single capital. So total social capital is not one individual capitalist. It is a competitive system where many capitals are competing with each other, and they can also grow rich by buying from each other, not only by selling to the workers. So he says that the element of time is missing, and underconsumptionists try to resolve a problem which can be resolved only at the level of many capitals, at the level of one individual capital. So they don't understand the process of competition, and they don't understand the movements of profitability. So he says that capitalist system can generate sufficient demand for filling the demand gap if the rate of investment increase sufficiently to create sufficient additional demand for producer goods as well as consumer goods. So if that, the second point that Marx puts forth is this. He says that real effective demand for the net product originates only in the capitalist class, not in the working class. Why? Because workers' wages are a function of initial capital investment. Workers cannot buy back more than their wages. They are going to buy back only that part of net product which is equal in value to their wages. And wages are not surplus value. They are different from surplus value. Therefore, they don't refer to the surplus product as such. They refer to the necessary product. So workers can only buy back their part of the net product, necessary product, which is equal in value to their wages. So actually demand gap is not created there because they are buying all of their necessary product. Demand gap is created in surplus product. So the actual real effective demand for fulfilling the demand gap, it originates in the capitalist class. And third point which Marx says is that it is not the individual consumption of workers which is main in this real effective demand, because their decisions of individual consumption are based on their decisions of investment. In other words, their consumption is the dependent variable. Their decisions to undertake new investment is the independent variable. So it is not their consumption demands as such, but their investment demand, which is the true source of real effective demand, which can fulfill the demand gap. So basically Marx is saying that it is profitability which is the regulator of production in capitalism, not the consumption. It is the new investment decisions undertaken by the capitalist which determine the new effective demand which can fill the demand gap of the previous cycle of production. So if there is sufficient increase in the net investments, then the demand gap created in the previous cycle can be filled by the capitalist class through the additional demands for consumer goods, but more importantly, additional demand for new producer goods. So the true mark of crisis, if you read any good political economists, empirical political economists, they measure the buying and selling within capitalist class. If that is going down, that is the true measure of an impending crisis. When the rate of sale of means of production goes down, in the main, that is the true sign, the master sign of an impending catastrophe. So what Marx is saying is that under certain conditions, what are those conditions? If the net investments are increasing in the current cycle vis-a-vis the previous cycle, it is possible for capitalist system to reproduce itself on an expanded scale. So he says that it can grow, it can accumulate, and it can reproduce itself on a larger scale if the net investments increase in an adequate and proportional fashion. Marx is not saying that it will happen. Marx is saying that it does happen and it can happen, though not in a smooth process but in a turbulent fashion, where market post festum, after the festival, disciplines capital. If there is a disproportionality in the supply of various goods and services, capitalists cannot know about that beforehand because there is no collective planning, undertaken by capitalist class as a whole, that we will produce this good and this services in this proportion and quantity, this good and this services in this. It's not like that. But market a posteriori, post festum, corrects and disciplines capital, and through these short-term fluctuations and turbulence, through this undershooting and overshooting, capitalist system can reproduce itself if there is a sufficient increase in the rate of investment, if the net investments increase adequately and proportionately, more or less. So for Marx, growth is possible, accumulation is possible, though not without turbulence, not without fluctuations, not without undershooting and overshooting. What he says in his poetic language, capitalist mode of production is the production of regularity through irregularities, production of patterns through fluctuations. But there is a pattern which is produced and reproduced. So he says that it can happen, it doesn't mean it will happen. On the basis of Marx's first volume of Capital, before all of this Marx says in the second volume, where he discusses his reproduction schema, where he says that Department 1 and Department 2, what are the conditions of proportionality in case of simple reproduction and in case of expanded reproduction, how the two basic departments of production can be proportional so that both interact in a symbiotic fashion and absorb their product. So a proportionality of use value and exchange value, basically, product and income, basically. What are the conditions of proportionality? What happened from here? Two things happened. One, Russian populists, they had not read Capital Volume 2 because Capital Volume 2 was published in 1885. So they read only Capital Volume 1 and they understood the process of surplus product, how surplus product is produced, and they came to the conclusion that who will buy this surplus product? So there will be a demand gap. In Russia, capitalism cannot develop. That was their argument. Why? They said that Western capitalist countries, their capitalism can develop due to two reasons. One, their control of foreign trade and their possession of colonies and semi-colonies. So Britain and France and Germany, and to a lesser extent Germany and even Portugal, Spain, Holland, they can develop capitalism because they have colonies and control of foreign trade to absorb their overproduced commodities. But Russia is not in that position. Therefore, in Russia, capitalism cannot develop, and they were socialists. They said, in Russia, we will skip the stage of capitalism, and the Russian village community, Mir, the supposedly egalitarian village community will become the basis of socialism. So we will take a leap, skipping the stage of capitalism. We will directly arrive at socialism. We don't need to go through the painful, transition of capitalism before we reach socialism. We will directly reach socialism. They were critiqued by Tugan Baranovsky, Bulgakov, Peter Struve, and most importantly, Lenin. These theorists showed that, first of all, the Russian populists are empirically wrong because capital is actually developing rapidly in Russia. And secondly, they showed that capitalism can create its markets. It is not necessary that it will create its market. Capitalist production can create its markets, and Lenin showed, using the reproduction schema of Marx, that under these conditions, capitalism can grow, can accumulate, it can develop in Russia also, and it is indeed developing in Russia. But among these critics of Russian populists, Tugan Baranovsky goes to another extreme. He says production in capitalism is totally independent of consumption. Capitalist class can simply grow by selling and buying among each other. And if we have a planned production, that is, if the disproportionality between departments is done away with, in other words, if the anarchy of production is done away with, then capitalism can maintain a proportionality between departments and it can reproduce itself forever, indefinitely. This school was called harmonist school, or which believed in the harmony of departmental proportionality and harmony within capitalism, which is possible if there is a planned capitalism. Rudolf Hilferding took the idea of Tugan Baranovsky in Germany in 1920s and gave the thesis of organized capitalism. So he said that if a state monopoly trust, through process of monopolization, concentration and centralization of capital, if a state monopoly trust comes into existence, then it can undertake a planned production. Anarchy of production will be gone. So we as social democrats, which was the term used for communists at that time, we just need to do one thing: be in parliament, fight elections, and fight for planned production. Planning, fight for planning. If the planning is there, then we have no bone to pick with capitalism. We are okay with capitalism. Organized capitalism is good. Planning should be there, and now it has become possible because we are in the age of monopoly capital, whose highest organizational form is state monopoly trusts controlling the entire social production, and they can then plan the production in a proportionate manner, and anarchy of production is gone, crisis is gone, capitalism becomes capable of reproducing itself ad infinitum. To this harmonist fantasy, Rosa Luxemburg's underconsumptionism was a pathological reaction. Rosa Luxemburg said that it is impossible to have proportionality ever in capitalism, and the reproduction schema of Marx in Capital Volume 2, it applies algebraically, but it doesn't apply in the real world, and therefore Marx's reproduction schema itself is responsible for creating this harmonist fantasy. So Rosa Luxemburg thought that Marx was saying that capitalism will reproduce itself irrespective of conditions, and that was the basis of Rosa Luxemburg's overall argument. Rest of the thing is all that we have discussed in underconsumptionism. Rosa Luxemburg said that inherently capitalism will always create demand gap. For this demand gap, you cannot find a buyer within capitalist system. Within capitalist system, she says Malthus was wrong. Landlord class cannot be the factor which absorbs the overproduction, because rent is a derivative form of income which comes from the produced surplus value itself. Wages increment is not possible, because wage increment, howsoever wages are increased, they can only buy back only their part of the net product, necessary product. They cannot buy the surplus product, because surplus value is appropriated by capitalists. It is capitalists who will buy the surplus product. Wages will be used only to buy back the necessary part of the net product. So increasing wages is also not a solution. There is a solution which is suicidal solution. What is that solution? The solution is non-capitalist periphery, colonies and semi-colonies, and by loot and plunder of colonies and semi-colonies, and by selling to them constantly, by becoming a net seller to the non-capitalist periphery, the advanced capitalism can resolve its problem of demand gap. But Rosa Luxemburg says the problem is that the moment the non-capitalist periphery comes into contact with advanced capitalism, the pre-capitalist modes of production disintegrate there, capitalist mode of production develops there, and as soon as capitalist mode of production has taken hold of these non-capitalist peripheries, this factor of solution is gone. The golden goose is killed. So as the non-capitalist periphery shrinks in the world, she says, inter-imperialist rivalry will become sharper for the remaining opportunities in the non-capitalist periphery. It will lead to wars and world wars, which will create revolutionary situation in various countries, will lead to revolution and final breakdown of capitalist system. There are two obvious problems here. One, if this problem is solved by constantly selling to the non-capitalist periphery, then we are having a situation where non-capitalist periphery is a constant net buyer and the capitalist core is a constant net seller. But if that is the situation, where is the extra income coming in the non-capitalist periphery in order to be a constant net buyer? It can be shown empirically that it is not possible. No periphery can be a constant net buyer. What was happening in the non-capitalist periphery was a process of primitive accumulation. Through loot and plunder of the colonies, their resources, the taxation which was imposed upon them, and this is true that with this export of capital was also happening, investment of capital was also happening, and a very stunted and truncated kind of limited capitalist development was happening in colonies and semi-colonies. But it is impossible for a periphery to be a net buyer constantly. And second problem was the same, element of time. Rosa Luxemburg, like all underconsumptionists, misses the element of time. She misses the fundamental point that capitalist production is characterized by the circuit money, commodity, more money. MCM prime, not CMC. It is not production for consumption, it is production for profit. It is production for selling for profit. And that is the basic point that is missed by all underconsumptionists, and this basic confusion basically leads to all the underconsumptionist arguments. MR school, monthly review school, basically builds upon the thesis of Rosa Luxemburg and mixes basically the post-Keynesians like Michael Kelesky, Michel Kelesky, Joseph Steindl, Joan Robinson, and they mix it up. They add only two elements in the basic underconsumptionist thesis. They say that the demand gap will increase faster than imagined because capitalists will increase the capital-labor ratio during their competition. When the organic composition of capital or capital-labor ratio increases, then the consumption of the working class goes even lower and productive capacity of system increases even faster. So the demand gap will increase much faster. And second element they take from Hobson, they say that in the age of monopoly pricing also depresses average consumption. So monopoly pricing leads to even lower levels of consumption, and due to this the demand gap, their theory was permanent stagnation. They said due to this persistent demand gap, the capitalist system will try to fill it with what? Wars, advertisement industry, non-productive investments, but it will not resolve the problem. So there will be a permanent stagnation until revolution arrives. That's what their thesis, their basic thesis. I'm oversimplifying things because there are many other things that Paul Sweezy and Paul Baran say. Some of good empirical research also they've done, but their basic argument is like this. So underconsumptionism in generally, the monthly review school failed to explain that if there is a permanent stagnation and if the capitalists are unable to utilize even the existing productive capacity, why would they increase organic composition of capital? You get the point. So for example, I am capitalist. I am unable to use my existing productive capacity because of lack of sales. Then why would I increase my productive capacity further? I will increase my productive capacity further only and only if I am able to optimally utilize my existing productive capacity in competition with other capitalists. If profitability goes down, then it is another thing. But otherwise, it is not the demand gap or problem of realization which leads to such a situation. So there were many logical anomalies, and so underconsumptionism in general fails to explain the real phenomena of capitalist society. It can be shown logically and empirically that it is not the demand gap itself or underconsumption itself which is the cause of crisis. It can be shown empirically that on the contrary, underconsumption is a symptom of crisis caused by deeper reasons. There are other reasons which cause this crisis of underconsumption. Why it is popular? Due to its simplicity. It is most accessible thing. So even as kids, we used to think that the cause of crisis is insufficient sale of commodity. It appears very commonsensical, but if common sense was true, there was no need for science. Science is basically a critique of common sense. Common sense takes apparent reality for essential reality. Science questions apparent reality, penetrates the layers of apparent reality, and reaches the essence of the problem. So it is very popular everywhere it's one of the most popular left theory. If not Marxist, it's the most popular left theory. So this brings us to the last section of our discussion. How much time am I left? At what time did we start? 6:30? 6:15. So I still have half an hour. So this brings us to the third crisis theory, Marxist crisis theory, which is capitalism as a system where the barrier to accumulation is capital itself, or capitalism as self-limiting accumulation. It has two parts: Marx's theory of law of tendential fall in the rate of profit, and the other is profit squeeze theories. Marx is very clear that capitalists often do expand their productive capacity faster than the capacity of the society to absorb that production. It happens. But Marx says that this regular occurrence of capitalist society only leads to short-term fluctuations, the realization problem, which is regularly also corrected by market. So it's not the underlying cause of crisis. So as we saw, Marx says that it only leads to a new social division of labor. If, for example, some or few commodities are overproduced, they are sold either at a price lower than their value, or they are not sold at all, then in the next cycle some capital will flow from those branches of production to other branches of production, and a new social division of labor would emerge according to the movements of profitability. So the problem of underconsumption itself is not a problem which leads to the crisis as a general failure of the system to reproduce itself. So he says that under certain conditions the system can reproduce itself, as we saw. What is that condition? That condition is that there should be sufficient increase in the net investments. Then he asks, what is the factor which drives investments? So he says, and this was the question which was never answered by either neoclassicals or the Keynesians or the underconsumptionists, because all of them assumed that it is consumption which drives and regulates production in capitalism. Marx answers this. Smith and Ricardo also agreed, but Marx answers this question in the most consistent, most logical and most scientific fashion, and he says that it is profitability which regulates and determines production in capitalist system. It regulates the rate of investment in capitalist system. But the problem is that in capitalism there is a long-term tendency of the average rate of profit to fall, and it is precisely this tendency, this secular tendency of the average rate of profit to fall, due to which capitalist system degenerates into recurrent cyclical crises which become ever deeper, more structural, with passing time. It's not a cycle, it's a downward spiral. So the crisis of profitability hits capitalist system regularly, but not at the same level, but at a more structural and deeper level. So when the rate of profit falls, rate of investments fall, employment falls, sale of producer goods and consumer goods fall, a demand gap is created, and therefore underconsumption happens. So he doesn't say that underconsumption does not happen. He says that underconsumption does happen, but it is not the cause of the crisis, it is a symptom of the crisis. So first we'll understand Marxist theory of LTFRP very briefly, because that is the cornerstone of Marxist theory of crisis. So he says that the very ways employed to increase profit, the very methods employed by capitalists to increase the profit, ultimately and eventually lead to fall in the average rate of profit, and therefore the limits to capitalist system are immanent, inherent, inbuilt within the system, and the barrier to accumulation of capital is capital itself. When the rate of profit falls, it leads to increased competition among capitalist class, it leads to increasing unemployment, it leads to attack on the wages and labor rights of workers, it leads to intensified class struggle, and he reminds us that it is not the increase in the wages which leads to the crisis of profitability. He says that increase in wages as a result of class struggle can exacerbate the crisis of profitability if it is already there. It is possible to have a situation in which rate of profit is also increasing and real wages of workers are also increasing. So Marx says that increase in wages is not the cause of crisis of profitability. So why crisis of profitability happens? This also can be understood in points. The first point that Marx makes is that in every society there is allocation of social labor in definite proportion and quantities to different branches of production. Even pre-capitalist societies, in every society it happens. In pre-capitalist society, the allocation of social labor to different branches of production, in other words, the social division of labor, is regulated by extra economic factors, political coercion, law, religion, convention, tradition, etc. But in capitalist society, the social division of labor happens according to the movements of profitability. As we just discussed, that if movements of profitability change, if some particular branch of production is facing the crisis of profitability, some capital will flow from those branches to other branches. So whenever movements of profitability change, a new social division of labor emerges. But the movement of profitability is reflected basically in the movement of prices and profits. So basically it is movements of prices and profits, because profits are realized through prices, right? You sell a particular thing at a particular price. A part of it is the constant capital and variable capital which the capitalist has used to buy means of production and pay to the hired workers, and rest is surplus value. Price can be decomposed into these parts. So when I realize the price of a product, I realize also my profit. So the prices are determined, themselves are determined by the total labor spent in the production. Right? So means of production represent past labor. For example, if I am using certain means of production, raw materials, machinery, instruments of labor in my production, I am buying it from some other capitalist or commodity producer who have spent labor in production of those commodities, and you can go down in this series to a level where you will reach agriculture and extractive industries, where there are no means of production, only labor is used to produce, using natural elements to produce something. So all production can be broken down into spent labor plus nature. As Marx said, refuting Adam Smith, when Adam Smith said that the source of all wealth is labor, Marx said, no, source of all wealth is not labor. Wealth has two sources, labor and nature. Source of all value is labor. So Marx says that prices are basically the indirect labor is spent in the production and the direct labor. Indirect labor or past labor or dead labor is represented by means of production used in the process of production, and the living labor adds new value to that direct labor or living labor. So, and profits are determined by the proportion in which the new labor is divided into wages and profits. For example, workers, when they engage in production, they have to produce first the value equal to their wages and then value over and above the value of the wages or value of their labor power, socially speaking. So workers have to reproduce the value equal to their wages and then produce over and above that surplus value. And it is precisely that surplus value which determines profit, which is profit. Rate of surplus value and rate of profit are different things, but mass of surplus value and mass of profit is the same thing. It's just that the mass of surplus value, when compared only with wages, it is rate of surplus value. Mass of surplus value compared with total investment, that is wages plus constant capital spent on means of production, that is rate of profit. So rate of surplus value is different, that is like rate of surplus value is equal to S upon V, surplus value upon variable capital. Rate of profit is equal to S upon C plus V, that is constant capital and variable capital. So these rates will differ, but this is the same, mass of surplus value or mass of profit. Anyway, so that is the first point. Second point of Marx is that in the process of production, workers use instruments of labor to transform the raw materials into finished goods. That is what production is. You use instruments of labor to transform the raw material into finished goods. That is, total labor time in the production is equal to indirect labor time represented by means of production and direct labor time represented by living labor that the workers spend in production. So basically you can say that total labor time is equal to C, which represents the indirect labor time or means of production, plus L, that is direct labor spent by the workers in the current process of production. Right? This total labor time determines the value of the commodity, which is thus determined by indirect labor time and direct labor time. Now, indirect labor time, that is the third point of Marx. During this L, the direct labor time, the total working day, the workers must produce first the value equal to their wages and then surplus value, and it is precisely this division of direct labor time into necessary labor time and surplus labor time which is the basis of existence of class society, capitalist society. Without that, the capitalists will be deprived of their means of existence and their means of rule. Neither can they survive as a parasitic class totally divorced from manual labor, nor can they rule upon the working class through the instrument of state. So neither can they have their state, nor can they have their economic class domination. Neither political domination is possible, nor economic domination is possible. So if the workers do not produce surplus value over and above the value of their wages, why would any capitalist hire them? Capitalists hire worker precisely because they produce in this direct labor time value equal to their wages and value over and above the value of their wages. Then Marx says that the rate of exploitation or the rate of surplus value is this. This is also called rate of exploitation. Just 1 second. So the value of commodity or total labor time is equal to C plus L. Now L is divided into two parts, necessary labor time and surplus labor time. necessary labor time in which the workers produce value equal to the value of their wages, and surplus labor time is the part of the working day when they produce surplus value. So basically S, I'm just shifting this, S is equal to TLT minus, sorry, just a second. S is equal to TLT minus NLT, or is equal to L minus V. This is total labor time, L, and NLT is variable capital, value equal to their wages. So S is equal to L minus V. I'm just showing why rate of profit will fall through some mathematical formalizations. So the rate of surplus value, if it increases, then all other things remaining constant, the mass of surplus value and mass of profit will increase. Now, in any given period of time, this is given, the length of the working day. It's a given datum for any given period of time. And the value of wages, which is determined by the value of wage goods which regularly go into the consumption of workers, this is also given, right? मतलब वो जो wage goods workers consume करते हैं, उनका एक social average is given at every, it's a given datum for any time, and this working day, length of the working day is also given. So the rate of surplus value can be increased in two ways. Either the total labor time, which is divided into NLT and SLT, is increased. If the total labor time itself is increased, then NLT is given and SLT increases, right? If the total labor time increases, then if the wages are given, then the surplus labor time increases. This is what Marx calls absolute surplus value. But the other way is that I decrease, the labor time remains the same, but NLT is decreased relatively, then also SLT increases. The first method is called increasing surplus value by absolutely increasing the labor time or working day, or absolute surplus value. The second method is called relative surplus value. In the early stages of capitalism, capitalists regularly resort to the first method. In the lack of sufficient increase in labor productivity, they try to maximize their surplus value, the mass of their profits, by absolutely increasing the length of the working day, prolongation of the working day. The 10th chapter of first volume is dedicated to, first volume of Capital by Marx is dedicated to precisely this, how there was a intensification of class struggle between capitalist class and working class in the early stages of capitalist development and capitalist industrialization, where capitalist class was continuously striving to increase the total working time, that is the working day, and working class fought back and stopped capitalist class from increasing it further. And otherwise also there is a physical limit to it, 24 hours. You cannot make the working day 24 hours, right? Because in that case the working class would be unable to reproduce its labor power in a healthy state. So a part of capitalist class also, capitalist intelligentsia, bourgeois intelligentsia at that time fought against prolongation of the working day. So Marx quotes at length factory inspectors and doctors' reports, where factory inspectors and doctors oppose the prolongation of the working day, use of child labor, women labor, they oppose the use of night work, and they say that this is not allowing the British working class to reproduce itself in a healthy state. And they talk about the average life expectancy, that sharp fall in that the average life expectancy in Manchester reached 22 years. So they started working around 8-9 years child labor, and in some trades 6 years. You read 10th chapter, it can be read separately also. beautifully written labor history, if you will, where Marx shows how it was happening. So absolute surplus value has two limits. One, class struggle by workers. Two, a physical limit. If the working class is unable to reproduce its labor power in a healthy condition, then capital is nothing but dead labor. If the working class cannot objectify its labor and produce surplus value, then capital also cannot exist. And bourgeois intelligentsia, when it did oppose this, it was not as if it was conscious what it was doing. You get my point? It was not that it was consciously thinking about the better future of capitalism, and it was not as if it was telling you, do not know what you are doing, you bloody capitalists, don't prolong the working day because you will not be able to survive. They were really humanist people. Humanist middle class bourgeois, petty bourgeois intelligentsia, which was really, for example, Charles Dickens wrote Hard Times. So, and he was influenced by the ideology of utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham and Mill. So he really felt about the pain of the working class and these painful aspects of the process of industrialization, the early stages of industrialization. So we should never resort to any kind of conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are a placebo. When you cannot have a consistent logical explanation of something, you resort to conspiracy theory. It's an idealistic theory where you try to find causes of social phenomena in the intentions of individual. But the intentions of individual are not biological, they are socially and historically constructed. So they were really good people. In fact, one Dr. Ure was there, which Marx quotes again and again, who worked on child labor and women labor and night work and how it totally dehumanized the working class. And you can see in those quotes that he was writing from heart. He was really affected by it. And he said that capitalism should be human and industrialization should be human. So absolute surplus value had a historical limit. Even today, capitalists used this method of absolute surplus value. For example, Modi's labor code is nothing but using methods of absolute surplus value by creating the categories of apprentice worker, trainee worker, and allowing the capitalists to use their labor for 12 hours, 10 hours in the name of training and giving a skill. And they are saying these workers should be grateful to the capitalists that they are giving them opportunity to learn the trade and learn the craft. So they should work for 10 and 12 hours. And what Modi in one of his speeches called this freedom to do labor. Kaam karne ki azadi. Right? So, and he gave examples of capitalists who work for 12 hours and they will work because they are the owner. So give us all these factories for our collective ownership and we will also work for 10 hours if we find it necessary for our collective good. That's what Soviet workers did and Chinese workers did. Anyway, so in the later stages of capitalism, capitalists employed the second method, this method, decreasing the necessary labor time by increasing the productivity of labor in general, and especially, particularly in those industries which produce wage goods. Through that, the value of labor power can be decreased. It doesn't mean that real wages decline. Nominal wages can decline, and yet the real wages can increase. Real wages refers to the actual basket of consumer goods that you can buy with your nominal wage. And it is possible to have lower nominal wage and yet higher real wage if the value of all elements within the basket of consumer goods declines. So that if the value of all wage goods decline, then even if the nominal wage remain stagnant or decline, the real wages will increase. Right? So this is this method of increasing relative surplus value. It has also a limit. Right? For example, maximum surplus value, what can be the maximum surplus value? Maximum surplus value will be when V tends to 0. Right? As Marx said, if workers lived on air, that is the maximum notional limit of surplus value. You are getting it? For example, if surplus value is total labor time minus necessary labor time, or in money terms, L minus V, then if V tends to 0, the surplus labor time will become the whole labor time, or the total labor time will become the surplus labor time, tend to become. Right? So the maximum limit for surplus value is when the entire working day he is working for capitalist. The total labor time has become surplus labor time. Beyond that, you cannot increase surplus value. And that is also notional, because actually workers cannot live on air. So even if the organic composition increases a lot, number of workers comes to a minimum, and the wages of workers, nominal wages, decline, even if real wages are increasing due to the cheapening of wage goods, even then there is a maximum limit to the production of increase in the production of surplus value. So basically, if that is the maximum limit of surplus value, then what can be the maximum rate of profit? Rate of profit was S upon C plus V. V tends to 0, then rate of profit maximum, मैं थोड़ा आलसी हो रहा हूँ, ऐसे लिख रहा हूँ, सीधा लिख देता हूँ. Rate of profit maximum would be S upon C, because V has tended to 0. This is the maximum rate of profit, notional maximum rate of profit. Once this limit is reaching, the rate of profit will fall, because C will continue to increase. Why? Because due to internal competition of capitalists, the capitalists will be forced to increase investment in higher technology, more advanced machinery. It will not increase value. What it will do that in the same labor time, more use values will be produced. So the same value will be distributed over a larger mass of commodities. So the price of per unit commodity will decline. Even when the surplus value reaches the maximum notional limit, and therefore the rate of profit reaches a maximum notional limit, right? Then, even then, the investment in constant capital to modernize and introduce more advanced technology and machines will continue because of competition among capitals, because they are involved in a price competition. So value will remain same, but that same value will be distributed over a larger mass of use value, and price per unit will decline. So C will continue to increase because of the internal competition among capitalists. So capitalists consider the rate of profit as the regulator of production. They don't know about this rate of, they always compare their profit with total investment, कि 1 टके पे कितना मिला, 1 रुपया लगाया तो कितना पाया, तो 1 रुपये का कितना हिस्सा वेजेस पे गया और कितना हिस्सा मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन. इट बॉदर्स देम द लीस्ट. देयर फॉर देम द रेगुलेटर ऑफ इन्वेस्टमेंट इज द रेट ऑफ प्रॉफिट. But the profit is increasingly by relative surplus value. But the methods used to increase the relative surplus value meet a ceiling periodically. When the productivity is hitting a ceiling, then the rate of surplus value for that particular period is the maximum rate of surplus value and maximum rate of profit. Once that ceiling is reached, this ceiling is broken periodically when a new invention comes and the rate of surplus value is increased further. But there is a physical limit to that. Once that physical limit is reached, then mass of profit and mass of surplus value cannot increase S max, but constant capital, that is investment on means of production, continue to increase, leading to decline in the average rate of profit, because the denominator is increasing but the nominator is stagnant, more or less. This is mathematical formalization. It doesn't happen like this. It happens with a lot of turbulence, lot of ups and downs, undershooting, overshooting, all of that happens. But As a secular tendency, it happens, it can be proven empirically. It has been proven, in fact, empirically. So, there is a secular tendency in the rate of profit to fall. There are two countervailing factors. One, increase in the rate of surplus value. When the increase in the rate of surplus value is faster than the increase in the organic composition of capital. That is, when the rate of surplus value is increasing faster than the increasing capital labor ratio, then rate of profit will increase, because the numerator is increasing faster than the denominator. But when the rate of surplus value meets its physical ceiling, then rate of profit falls. So temporarily it can halt the fall in the rate of profit, but it cannot halt that fall permanently. The second factor is that cheapening of means of production, because when the labor productivity is increasing generally, then means of production, that is machinery and raw material, they also become cheaper. So even though the physical mass of means of production is increasing, its monetary expression does not increase with the same rate, with the same speed. So even though capital, means of production are increasing relatively faster than the labor employed in production, it is not reflected in money terms equally. So means of production cheapen, raw material also cheapen with increasing labor productivity. But if accumulation is happening, that is expanded reproduction is happening, then even though the per unit price or per unit cost of machine decreases, the total cost of the system of machines increases. So if I'm employing, for example, this is one machine that I'm employing, and this is increasing. I'm increasing, and the labor is decreasing relatively as compared to the mass of machines. But mass of machines also grow larger. So even if per unit cost of machines decline, the total cost of machine system that I employ for production increases. So these are two countervailing factors. One is increase in the surplus value rate, and other is cheapening of machines. They can temporarily halt the fall in the rate of profit, but they cannot stop it permanently. So what they do, these countervailing factors, they convert the absolute law of fall in the rate of profit into tendential law of fall into. So there is a secular tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So it doesn't fall like a straight line graph. If you look at a short duration, you will find a lot of turbulence. But if you take a long duration view or a macro view, then you will find that despite these small turbulences and undershooting, overshooting, there is a historical tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Smith knew about it, Ricardo knew about it, Malthus knew about it, and they said that there is a tendency in the average rate of profit to fall in the long duration, but they do not give the correct explanation. Smith says that overcrowding of capital in certain branches leads to fall in the rate of profit, but he could not explain when the entire system's average rate of profit is falling down. Ricardo gave the theory of law of diminishing returns. He said that agriculture progresses from better lands to worse lands, so cost of production increases in agriculture, so wage goods become costlier. If wage goods becomes costlier, then wages are also, it creates an upward pressure on wages, because if wage goods are becoming dearer, then higher wages will be required to meet the expenses, regular expenses of workers. So law of diminishing returns says that the declining productivity in agriculture leads to higher costs in agriculture, leads to increase in the average prices of agricultural products, which include wage goods and raw material, and therefore the rate of profit falls. Marx said that, where did you get that idea from? Productivity of agriculture has been increasing as a secular tendency, because the assumption that agriculture always proceeds from better lands to worse lands is wrong, first of all. Second, you are taking only the natural element of productivity, fertility of soil. The same fertility of soil In other words, the fertility of soil can be constant and yet the productivity of labor can be increased by increasing, labor productivity, fertilizers, machinery, etc., etc. So Marx refuted Ricardo and showed empirically that that is not true. Law of diminishing returns is a false law. So they did not have correct explanation. But every classical political economist knew that there is a secular tendency in the average rate of profit to fall under capitalism. Marx's innovation was not finding that it happens. Marx's innovation was to find the real underlying cause of the tendency of the average of rate of profit to fall in the long run. So, and history has proven this. Those who are interested in reading some empirical work from earlier period, it's Victor Perlo who actually provides you with empirical data which shows a secular tendency of decline in the average rate of profit. In last 30-40 years, some excellent research, because national accounts of all countries except India have become much more meticulous, because India, whatever meticulous was there is gone. The best Modi's slogan is ignorance is bliss. If we don't know we are getting poorer, we are not getting poorer. That is a basic dictum of Modi government. Anyways, so Victor Perlo is there. Then one scholar, Esteban Maito, has calculated world rate of profit. Very interesting study. Esteban Maito, you can search, his paper is available online. Then there is Michael Roberts, whose work Long Depression presents a lot of data. Guglielmo Carcelli, World in Crisis, which he co-wrote with Michael Roberts, and also Through the Prism of Value, though the book is flawed in some respects, but data is there. Anwar Sheikh's book, Capitalism, that is the best in terms of most systematic, meticulous, empirical data. You can read him. Anwar Sheikh, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict and Crisis. Then Schwartz, Jason Schwartz is there. Alan Freeman is there, Andrew Kleiman is there, Fred Mosley is there. So much of rich empirical research is there, and from that period also you can take Ernest Mandel, Victor Perlo, 70, 60 years ago. And even before that, classical political economists showed that rate of profit falls. So this is not like we have to prove that it falls. We have to only understand why it falls. Everybody knows it falls. So, as in his critique of Michael Heinrich, Andrew Kleiman has written a very, succinct, in a very brief and succinct manner, he has written a beautiful essay where he says that it starts with his own quotation that economists have changed Marx in various ways. The point, however, is to understand him. And he attacks Michael Heinrich, who says, Michael Heinrich says that it doesn't fall. You have to prove that it falls. So, in the end of the essay, Andrew Kleiman writes that, in fact, Marx didn't have to show that it does indeed fall. He had to find why it falls. So, this theory is being suppressed by bourgeois, even some Marxist political economists, so-called Marxist political economists. They suppress this correct explanation of crisis, tendential fall in the rate of profit, and they force Marx in his grave to say other things. Like some people have tried to make Marx underconsumptionist. Some people have tried to make Marx disproportionate theorist, trying to force him to say things that he never said. So he says that we can compare Marx to Galileo when he was forced to extend an apology for his scientific inventions. In his diary he wrote, and yet it moves. The earth, they said that earth doesn't move around sun, sun moves around sun. So he said, even though you have forced me to say that earth is still and sun moves around it, revolves around it, but the problem is that yet it moves, the earth is still moving. So he says, and yet it falls, the rate of profit. Despite all attempts to disprove Marx or misappropriate Marx or misrepresent Marx or misinterpret Marx, it doesn't. And he also says that, Michael Heinrich, that it was not Marx's law third volume of Capital was edited by Engels, it is Engels's law. So Andrew Kleiman say it doesn't matter whose law, let's suppose it's my law, but you have to prove it's wrong, that it doesn't explain the actual empirical evidence. So this is the correct Marxist crisis theory, because it shows that it is the causes of the recurrent cyclical crises are inherent in the very dynamics of capitalism. The limits to capitalism are immanent to capital itself. They are inbuilt in the modus operandi of capitalist mode of production. It is not some external factor which causes the crisis, but the internal motion of capitalist system itself which generates cyclical recurrent crisis. But Marx doesn't say that crisis automatically leads to revolution. Marx never said that. Marx always said that all these crises which are recurring with at the same time becoming more structural and deeper and more serious, they create dual potential. The progressive potential is there and the reactionary potential is also there. Which potential is realized depends on the relative balance of class forces. Which class is prepared to exert force? Which class is prepared to realize its potential? If the proletariat is organized, it can realize the revolutionary potential by converting this crisis of capitalism, which also manifests as political crisis, into a revolutionary crisis. It can convert the political and economic crisis of bourgeoisie and capitalist system into a revolutionary crisis. But if it fails to do so, our punishment is barbarism. If we let the moment of, as Delian Guerin said, if we let the moment of revolution pass, fascism will be our punishment. And maybe that's the punishment we are facing right now. So every crisis has a dual potential. Every crisis is objectively a revolutionary opportunity, but only objective. You have to, systems don't fall on their own. Systems have to be overthrown. And that is the basic teaching of tendential fall in the rate of profit. Because if you, having a correct crisis theory is essential for having a correct politics. Because if underconsumptionism is problem, then the solution is not revolution, solution is increasing aggregate demand, a la Prabhat Patnaik and CPM and CPI and CPIM and Liberation and even certain so-called revolutionary communist ML groups. If you look at the Indian communist movement, the prevalent theory of crisis is underconsumptionism. They don't know it, but yet they do it. So if disproportionality is problem, the solution given by Hilferding is correct. Let's have an organized state monopoly capitalism where the production can be planned. And if the production is planned, then we get rid of crisis for good, once and for all. And then there is no need to overthrow capitalism. If over-financialization is problem, as उसका नाम मैं हमेशा भूल रहा डोमिनिक क्राइसिस ऑफ नियोलिबरलिज्म जिनकी बुक है डोमिनिक लेवी एंड Juvenile Levy and Dominic something. They say that over-financialization is the problem. So over-financialization is if they say that excessive investment in share markets and casino economy, this plethora of capital is the problem which is being invested in speculative things. Marx replied them, these people, in Capital Volume 3 itself. He writes that any plethora of capital is the plethora which cannot be invested profitably. So over-financialization also is a symptom of crisis of profitability. If profitability is healthy, capitalists will invest in productive economy. If profitability is down, then they will invest for quick profits in the share market and create a bubble of fictitious capital, which every time bursts and brings even deeper crisis. But capitalists don't think in long term. They are not allowed to think in long term by the very nature of capitalist mode of production. So having a correct crisis theory is very, very important. Now we come to the last thing, profit squeeze theories. Profit squeeze theories argue that increase in the wages leads to decline in the rate of profit, and that creates a profit squeeze situation. This school began in Marxist period itself. There were two conservative political economists, Bastiat and Carey. They started this line of argumentation. They said that therefore wages should be kept low, but Marxist variant appropriated this line that increase in wages leads to fall in the crisis and applied it for revolutionary politics, and said that even the crisis of capitalism is brought about by the subjective class struggle of proletariat, because through its class struggle it increases its wages and the rate of profit falls. But empirically it can be shown it doesn't happen. They are saying that when the rate of surplus value decreases because wages are increasing, profit falls. Marx said rate of profit falls precisely because of increase in the rate of surplus value. The methods used to increase the rate of surplus value. It is precisely through those methods that rate of profit falls. They say that if V increases, then S decreases and therefore rate of profit falls. So they are the opposite of the law of tendential fall in the rate of profit. They are saying the rate of increase in the rate of surplus value, the increase in the rate of surplus value, the decrease in the rate of surplus value by increasing wages brings about the crisis of profitability. Marx said crisis of profitability as a structural factor, recurrent structural phenomenon. It is brought about by the methods used to increase the rate of surplus value, not decrease in the rate of surplus value. So Marx says that increase in the wages might intensify the crisis of profitability if it is already there. And Ricardo himself knew that increase in wages in and by themselves do not lead to fall in the rate of crisis. In fact, you can read Wage, Labour and Capital, where Marx polemicizes against trade unionist Weston. Weston's argument was precisely this, that if wages increase, then rate of profit falls. Marx says wages cannot increase to such a limit where it makes the accumulation of capital impossible. So movement of wages happens within the limits posed by two things. One, wages cannot fall lower than required for the reproduction of working class in a physical shape. So wages cannot go so low that workers cannot reproduce their labor power in a healthy condition, and wages cannot go up propelled by class struggle that accumulation of capital itself becomes impossible. Then if it happens, and when it happens, capitalists go on a investment strike. They stop investing. If investing wages are so high that investment doesn't bring them profit, then they wouldn't invest in production. They would invest in something else. They would buy gold, land, they would invest in some kind of speculative enterprise. So profit squeeze theory is not the correct Marxist theory of crisis. So, and it is only the law of tendential fall in the rate of profit which systematically and logically and scientifically and empirically shows that capitalism is a historically transient mode of production. It is not the end of history. Its long-term trajectory is decline in the rate of profit creates even more serious crises which create dual potentials repeatedly. When not realized, they end in barbarism. They only reset the timer. Because every crisis is also a cathartic mechanism through which system resolves its crisis. Crisis is at the same time the mechanism through which crisis is resolved. Because what happens in the crisis? Rate of investment goes down, devalorization of capital because factories are lying inactive, so devalorization of capital, and this devalorization of capital restores profitability. Destruction of productive forces through wars, devalorization of capital through disinvestment and decline in the rate of investment, and this devalorization of capital leads to restoration of the rate of profit, not in a human fashion, through a lot of pain and suffering of common working masses, death and destruction. But that is how the counter is reset. But the counter is reset every time in more brutal and more barbaric fashion. And therefore it's not a cycle, it's a downward spiral. So what we are faced with today is socialism or annihilation. This planet cannot survive one more century of capitalist mode of production. Either we organize and undertake the task which has been given to us by history, or we should be prepared for periods of barbarism that we have not seen yet. Anyway, every few decades we realize that we have not seen this. What is happening in Palestine right now? What is happening in Ukraine right now? What is happening in domestic politics of different... This is glimpse of barbarism. It can get worse if we don't get out. So that is why having a correct crisis theory is essential for having a correct politics. This is a brief introduction to theories of crisis. I hope I was more or less successful in simplifying things, but you cannot simplify things after a certain limit, because then you are tampering with accuracy of things. So thanks for listening to this rather long presentation, and now if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
I would really appreciate if you can explain the formula a little bit more, just for the rate of profit.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, the simple thing is, see, it's my mistake, I'm sorry, I did it in a very messy way. So, first thing, mass of surplus value is S. It is equal to mass of profit. These are not two different things. Surplus value is a mass when related only to variable capital. Mass of profit is the mass when we relate it to total investment. Variable capital plus constant capital. Variable capital is spent on hiring workers, and constant capital is buying means of production. Right? Now, capitalists want to increase this because that is the mass of profit. Profitability is their main intention, main motive. The motive force for their investment, or the regulator of their investment, determinant of their investment, is increase in profit. Now, profit can be increased by increasing the rate of surplus value, not rate of profit. Profit, the mass of profit will increase if rate of surplus value increases, right? Now, rate of surplus value, mass of surplus value we saw is equal to total labor time minus necessary labor time, right? Or this you can write as V, because in monetary terms, necessary labor time is the time when the worker reproduces value equal to his wages. So it is L minus V. So what would be the maximum limit of surplus value? If the entire labor time becomes surplus labor time, that will happen only if V tends to 0. So mathematically speaking, maximum surplus value would be when V tends to 0, when the entire total labor time becomes surplus labor time. That will be the notional maximum limit. Notional because it's not real, it cannot happen. It can be decreased to a great extent, repeatedly decreased, but it cannot become 0, that is why notional. But to understand the logic mathematically, we are using the notional maximum of surplus value. So rate of profit, which is PR max, what would be that when S is max and in the denominator V is gone, we have only C, constant capital, right? Rate of profit cannot breach this ceiling. Because surplus value has reached its maximum because the wages tend to zero. When the wages tend to zero, surplus labor time tends to become total labor time. When that happens, that is the maximum limit for surplus value, right? But the denominator continues to increase, because if, for example, you are a capitalist, I am a capitalist, we are producing this particular commodity, glass. Both of us has modernized our technology and increased the productivity of labor to such a limit that we are tending towards this limit, right? When we are tending towards this limit, say total workers at this point are like 10 workers working for 8 hours every day. So every day 80 hours are being used for production, and we both of us have reached this limit. Even then, in these same hours you can produce 100 glass, or you can also produce 500 glass, depending upon the increase in the productivity of this same labor of 80 hours. So the competition between us to increase the productivity of labor and introduce more advanced technology and machinery will continue. Why? Because say 1 hour is equal to 1 rupee, right? So if in 80 hours I am producing commodities worth 80 rupees, sorry, no, 800 rupees, because 100 glasses I am producing, but you are using more advanced technology and you have increased the productivity of labor, and in the same 80 hours you are producing 500, right? So you are producing more use value. So basically value will not increase because social competition, because if you are producing a glass of 10 rupees and I am producing 100 rupees worth glass, consumers will still buy it at the social price, average price. So what will happen? Some value from my industry will transfer to your industry, and through that averaging, a average price will come into existence. In that case, what will happen? I will lose some value to you because you are more productive. I am selling my commodity at a price lower than my value. You are selling your commodity at a price higher than your value, right? So this is the competition between us, right? So that competition will continue, where we will compete to increase the productivity of labor. That can be increased only by investing more in machinery and technology. So this has already reached a maximum limit for the time being, but this will continue to increase due to our competition to decrease the cost per unit and therefore price per unit, and therefore the numerator is stagnant and the denominator is still increasing. So once this limit of surplus value is reached, the rate of profit will fall.
Beginning, you were talking about Marx said that this capitalist system can reproduce itself by increasing its rate of investment next cycle,
Yeah.
proceeding cycle. So when you say rate of investment, it indirectly indicates constant capital, right? The way we are.
No. Rate of investment includes both, na?
Both.
Yeah.
So
Investment on workers and investment on capital.
Of course, this is also but that's an ideal case where only the V becomes zero and.
No. We never become zero. So at any given time period or time bracket, the labor productivity increases. There are periods of leaps in labor productivity. Then a stasis comes. When there is a stasis, for that period, for example, if the V has reached its lowest possible limit, C still, so it's a mathematical formalization. That is why I said it is the notional maximum limit of surplus value. So this notional limit actually can never be increased. This is only to demonstrate that during the period when surplus value for that particular historical bracket reaches its maximum limit, where the labor productivity cannot be increased any further immediately, C still increases. Also because of economy of scale. Because even if, for example, any new machinery or technology is not coming, but you are producing at a scale which is smaller than mine, your cost will be larger, because economy of scale means waste decreases and productivity increases. So C will increase at any rate. There are periods when surplus value also increases and organic composition also increases. If the rate of surplus value is increasing faster than the capital labor ratio, then the rate of profit will increase during that period. But the thing is, the rate of surplus value always will hit that ceiling regularly, repeatedly. So for example, in 2007-8, that was the beginning of crisis, the latest Great Depression. Just before that, any new leap in productivity was not happening. So whenever you see these depressions happen, if you take Great Depression, 1925-26 was the period when the pace of organic composition of capital outstripped the increase in the rate of surplus value. So capital labor ratio was increasing faster. So actual real time thing would be like this. Rate of profit would always be like S upon C plus V. But if this composition, that is C is to V, is increasing at a rate faster than rate of surplus value, then this will fall, because the nominator is increasing slower than the denominator. So actually V will never become zero. That is only to demonstrate the fundamental logic why rate of profit will fall. This will always be there. There cannot be complete automation ever. Why? In capitalist society. Why? If, for example, this question arises again and again in our mind, what if all production is automated? So communists also become very worried about that. Then working class is gone, revolution is gone, sab khatam. But capitalism is producing for buying and selling, for profit. If there is no labor, there is no value, right? If there is no employment, there are no incomes. Who will buy? Right? Therefore, capitalism can never reach that stage of complete automation. So this is only for mathematical demonstration. Actually, it will always be the relation between these two. If this is rising faster, then rate of profit will increase. If this is rising faster, rate of profit will decline. Historically, you can show that as a secular tendency, this rises faster than this. Because when we can understand it in a very, for example, there is a commodity A. Its price includes C plus V plus S. This is total investment plus profit. If V decreases in a very fast fashion, S reaches a limit where almost total labor time is becoming, because in the total working day, like NLT is this much and this is SLT. So it acts kind of a ceiling, then again increasing. So that increase, the rate of increase in SLT becomes slower. It tends to become slower, but this doesn't. So in price of A, C increases faster than V. V tends to zero, never becomes zero, tends to zero. S becomes tends to reach to its maximum limits. In that case, this becomes stagnant, equal to total labor time, say, but this increases. So in the price component of any commodity, dead labor is increasing and living labor is decreasing. Then new value is not created. So most of the price of the commodity is coming from value of means of production. I cannot charge a rent on this because of competition. For example, if only C remains there, means of production cannot produce new value. They are produced value by past labor. They cannot produce new value without living labor. So people often thought that often think, then why cannot I charge a rent on my means of production, kind of an interest on my means of production? No, because if I there will be a declining tendency. How? If you and I are competitive, and for example we are producing this phone, and now it is both of our assembly lines are totally robotic, no human labor is involved, right? But we are in competition. You are charging 5% interest or rent, whatever you call, on the value of means of production. I will charge 4.5%. You will charge 4%. I will charge 3.5%. So it will tend to a limit where there is no possibility of charging any rent or interest on the value of means of production. Secondly, if we charge any interest or rent on the value of means of production, it is only transferring value from those industries which have not become totally automated yet. So because it happens at a social aggregate level. So we are not producing any value, but yet we are getting profit because other industries have not totally automatized, and part of their value, because they are still producing value because living labor is employed by them. We are not employing living labor, but that value, a part of that value will transfer to our branch. But all of this happens, I mean, these concepts are always clear, phenomena are always messy. So that's why Marx critiqued Proudhon for mistaking social phenomena for economic categories. So he wrote Mr. Proudhon thinks that economic categories walk in blood and flesh in actual life. No, they do not. Economic categories are abstraction and generalization of social phenomena. They give you an access to the essence of social phenomena. Social phenomena in itself is extremely rich and complex and messy. But contrary to what Slavoj Žižek thinks, Slavoj Žižek in one interview says that for messy reality we need messy theorization. No, messier the reality, clearer the theorization should be. So these concepts are basically, therefore they are an instrument to understand social phenomena. So this is how it happens. All of these things happen in averages, but the tendency is clear. Yeah, good question. See, those who want to reform capitalism often say that if you increase wages and, progressive taxation is implemented, then there is a redistribution of wealth and we can get a proportionality in income and product, and all product can be realized within the country without any problem. But they forget that we are talking about capitalist system. And in a capitalist system, the bourgeois state never does that. Why? Because, for example, when just take a real case. If today Indian state introduces an employment guarantee act for all citizens and says that it is the responsibility of the capitalist system to give employment to all, and if it fails to do so, it will give an unemployment allowance which is sufficient for your survival. In that case, unemployment allowance right now would be somewhere around 18 to 19,000 rupees. If you want to maintain your bare biological existence, you need that for your food, clothing, house rent, etc. Right? But if I give that unemployment allowance and introduce such an act, then the working class as a whole becomes less needy. And capitalist wants the working class to be needy so that it can force the working class to work on lower wages. If I set a minimum wages at right now, it should be somewhere around 37,000 according to 2200 calorie plus fuel plus clothing plus school plus medicine, etc. etc. There is a method to calculate it. So it should be around 37,000 per month. But if I really implement on paper in Delhi, it is already reaching 30,000. but it is never implemented. If the government really implements minimum wages, then capitalist class would object to that, because it creates an upward pressure on wages. It says that let the market decide the wages, but when market is not working for them, they want a stimulus package. That is another thing. But they would say that wages should be left on the free play of market, which means workers should be left at their mercy, because they own the means of production and workers would need to work for their physical survival. So that is why higher wages will never be accepted by the bourgeoisie. Why CII and FICCI and Chambers of Commerce issued statements in 2006-7 against Manrega? Precisely because of this. Because Manrega was making the working class less needy, less dependent. It is another thing. I am not supporter of Manrega. It's a way to keep the working class alive on the starvation line. The main purpose of people like Aruna Rai and CPI, CPM and these venereal disease experts of capitalism, their main purpose was to decrease the rural-urban migration, because every bourgeois politician knows that urban discontent is much more subversive and dangerous for system. So they had to, and it is available in the document proposal. Aruna Rai, she is saying कि समझ जाओ, इतना बढ़ रहा है, फंस जाओगे तुम लोग. कुछ ऐसा कुछ अर्बन डिस्कंटेंट फैला, लेबर मिलिटेंसी फैली, कैसे डील करोगे? इसलिए रोको, ये बहुत ज़्यादा हो रहा है गांव से शहरों में माइग्रेशन. सो मनरेगा वाज इंट्रोड्यूस्ड. अरुणा रॉय, yeah, I think so. She died. No, she passed away, I think. Aruna Roy. She's alive? Oh, sorry. No, generally when people like memoir, they pass away after a few years. She wrote it early. Anyway. So, that is why capitalist class will never... So, they are thinking about a system in its non-class interpolation, non-class purity. That a system is there, it is producing more, not sufficient demand, increase wages, fill the demand gap. But who is running the system? Who is the ruling? What they miss is the class element. And capitalist class never allows any upward pressure on wages, except, I am talking about capitalist class, not bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie can. Bourgeoisie is political class. Capitalist class organized as a political class. Capitalist class which understands it has a state project, a political project, is bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie can. Bourgeoisie can act against the wishes and wills of individual capitalists, because without that its political rule cannot be sustained. But capitalist class as an economic class always wants lowest possible wages. Redistribution of wealth also cannot be, because the rate of profit that they calculate is the rate of profit after taxation. There is two types of rate of profit: pre-taxation rate of profit, post-taxation rate of profit. So if taxes are increased, then the rate of profit, the entrepreneurial rate of profit, which is the actual regulator of production, also goes down, and the investments will go down. So it is a deduction from there. There are two types of taxes: direct corporate tax, that is a deduction from profit; indirect tax, and non-corporate income tax, deduction from wages and salaries. Right? So if corporate taxes are increased, why Modi government has decreased the average corporate tax from around 34% to 24%? Because capitalist class is faced with a crisis of profitability. So it has shifted the burden of tax from the capitalist class to the common working masses. That is why progressive taxation and higher wages. These are not the preferred policies of capitalist class. They always oppose it. Bourgeoisie sometimes does implement these policies because its political rule is threatened. Whenever its political rule is threatened, it takes decisions against particular capitalist interests, because it has to organize general long-term capitalist interests. In order to organize general long-term capitalist interest, capitalist government or state can take decisions which go against particular capitalist interests and short-term capitalist interests. It happens.
Very new to obviously political work, but lately I've been reading somewhere that Paul Samuelson has proved Marx wrong, that this socially necessary labor time deciding the price of
Yes, he has written a book called Economics. See, there are two ways to prove people correct or incorrect. One is you take the correct theory and deal with the correct theory in an honest fashion. The other is you misappropriate the theory. For example, Paul Samuelson has refuted Marx not only on this point, on many points. For example, he says that Marx said that society is divided into two classes. As we can see, any person with naked eyes can see this is incorrect. Marx never said that capitalist society is divided into two classes. Marx said that capitalist society's basic contradiction is between labor and capital, and two polar classes of capitalist society are capitalist class and working class. He never said that capitalist society has only two classes. Then he says that Marx said that gave the theory of absolute impoverishment of the working class. Absolute impoverishment of the working class theory said that imputes this view on Marx, that Marx said that the working class will become poorer and poorer and poorer and increasingly poorer, and then it will revolt. Marx never said that. So Samuelson shows that average wages of the working class have been increasing. Nominal wages, they are increasing. Sometimes even real wages are increasing. So Marx is proven incorrect. But Marx never said that. Marx never said that people involved in revolts and revolutions because they become totally destitute and pauperized. He said that the cause behind revolution is the contradiction between labor and capital. For example, in recent past, you look at all the workers' revolts, Maruti. They are one of the most well-paid workers. But the contradiction between labor and capital is there in the very process of production. The very process of production is materialized through this contradiction. The contradiction between labor and capital. So that contradiction, so it is a vulgar economic analysis कि पैसा कम मिला इसलिए बगावत करो, ऐसा नहीं होता. And the issue in 2011 revolt of Maruti workers was increasing speed of assembly line. Earlier they had to do 72 tasks in 1 minute, then they increased to 78 or 80, something like that. So in this way Samuelson has proved Marx wrong. So he has a thick book called Economics. The book is called Economics. He has co-written it with one of his students, William Nordus. Samuelson and Nordus, the most widely read textbook of neoclassical economics. So if you read Marx and then you read Samuelson, or you can do otherwise also, you read Samuelson and then you read Marx. He never quotes Marx even once in his entire book. Wherever he attacks Marx, not even a single quotation from Marx is given. So what he does, he erects a straw man, then rains it with his arrows, and then proclaims victory. He never deals with actual Marx, real Marx. So that is basically propaganda of bourgeois war. Anwar Sheikh deals with this question. He has
socially necessary.
Yeah. What?
No, Samuelson was specific about this deciding the price, socially necessary labor time, abstraction of that.
Yeah, because on that question, Samuelson doesn't make a distinction between value and price. So for Marx, for example, he says that there are various levels of determination of value. So one is individual value, which is determined by labor time taken by individual producer. But individual producers have different labor times. But the same commodity will not sell on different prices in the market. So, due to competition within a branch of production, social value emerges, which is determined by the average social labor time taken or spent in the production of a particular commodity. But commodities are still not sold on social value, because if there is a branch A of production, there is a branch B, and there can be many branches of production. If in one branch the social value gives a rate of profit which is 5%. And in this branch, social value gives a rate of profit which is 8%. Some capital from this sector will flow to this sector. And this will happen in all sectors. So capital will always have the propensity to flow from sectors of lower rates of profit to higher rates of profit. This will create a situation where the supply in this department will increase relative to its demand, because capital is flowing from lower rate profit sector to higher rate profit sector. Increase in supply will bring down the prices down, and the prices will be equalized to a level which gives average rate of profit, average profit to all sectors A, B, C, D. And therefore average prices will deviate from social value. So this happens due to competition within a branch, competition between branches, create what Marx calls prices of production or average price, which gives average profit to all branches. Because if one branch is more, this is not sustainable situation. This equilibration will happen due to competition in capitalist economy. And then short term fluctuations in supply and demand lead to market prices. We buy things at this. This as a general tendency hovers around the center of gravitation of prices of production. This hovers around social value. This is irrelevant. Competition ensures that individual value doesn't mean anything. But total price will be equal to total value. But prices of individual commodities will not be determined by socially necessary labor time of that commodity. Marx already said that. Samuelson's problem is that he never read Marx.
You spoke about effective demand, and there are these sources of effective demand. You explained the last one, especially I don't understand how profits themselves create effective demand.
Profitability creates higher level of investment. Demand is derivative of production, right? Effective demand. Because effective demand is demand backed by money. But money is what? Value. Value comes from production. So if the rate of investment increases, right, production of value also increases, wages increase, profits increase. So the effective demand of working class and capitalist class originate in the production itself, right? So if the rate of profitability is the regulator of investment, if there is the higher rate of profit, I would invest there. If there is a lower rate of profit, I would not invest there, right? So if investments go down, profits go down, investments go down, average income level in society goes down, then the effective demand also goes down.
Two individual makers decide to make a product of the same commodity. How is the social value decided? I mean,
By social average. For example, if say me, Hina and you, we produce this coffee mug, right? Your level of productivity determines your labor time. How much labor time will you take? For example, you take 6 hours of labor to produce 1 mug. I take 4 hours of labor to produce 1 mug. She takes 2 hours of labor to produce 1 mug. So we add the total and divide it by 3. That is the average social. Right? So average productivity in that particular branch of production, that will determine the social value. So if you are more efficient, then you will still sell at that price which is determined by social value. So for example, if you are more efficient, and so individual value of your cup is 5 rupees. Individual value of my cup is 7 rupees. And individual value of her cup is 9 rupees. So the cup will be sold at 7 rupees. Right? But your value is 5. So you are gaining 2 rupees extra. Because you are more efficient. So some value from her and her industry and my factory will transfer to. So it is only transfer of value. मतलब ये समझने में कई बार दिक्कत इसलिए होती है बिकॉज वी थिंक कि कौन कहाँ तय कर रहा है, कोई तय नहीं, मार्केट इंश्योर्स इट. दैट इज व्हाट एडम स्मिथ कॉल्ड कंपटीशन. अंडरस्टैंडिंग द फैक्ट दैट कैपिटलिज्म इज अ कॉम्पिटिटिव सिस्टम इज द की. वंस यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट कैपिटलिज्म इज अ कॉम्पिटिटिव सिस्टम वेयर डिफरेंट कैपिटल्स आर कॉम्पीटिंग with each other for maximization of their profit, that foundation is consolidated, then we understand everything. Because market will ensure that the cup is sold on 7 rupees. There is no prior decision making, subjective decision making at the plane of capitalism. Market will ensure it, but in a turbulent fashion. It happens with a lot of turbulence. It doesn't happen like a straight line. It's a very messy process. But even then, through these different irregularities, a regularity is produced, a pattern is produced. When all of us, for example, are producing this coffee mug, all of us are engaging in a competition to minimize the cost of our mug because we want to undersell each other. Those capitalists who are selling this mug at a cheaper price will have a larger share of the market, and that is what we are competing about. So our competition will give rise to these determinations of value through competition itself, through market itself, right? Because we are producing the same product. It will be sold on an average range of value, right? And one mug can be different from another mug. If this mug has a certain amount of labor, socially determined, which means whatever amount of labor you spend in it doesn't matter. One individual producer spend in it doesn't matter. As a social average, there is a certain amount of labor invested. It is another way of seeing this is only allocation of labor, social labor, right? You take all social production, you divide it by all social labor, you get the average. Market ensures that the social value is determined by that. But we still do not sell on social value. Because if our branch of production, coffee mug production industry, is highly profitable, then capital from less profitable industries will flow to our branch of production. Supply of mugs will increase because investments has increased, production will increase, supply will increase, but the demand is not keeping up with it, so prices will fall. Prices will fall below social value. The sector becomes less profitable, capital again flows out of this sector. Through this constant flow of capital across sectors determined by the movements of profitability, prices of production emerge, average price. Because every branch of capital says that we want average profit, right? And that average profit is formed through this flow, which leads to the formation of average prices. Then short-term fluctuation happen due to a lot of things. Logistical problems, breakdown of chains, supply chains, etc. So due to that, short-term fluctuations happen. But short-term fluctuations happen around this center of gravitation, average prices. And average prices have social value as their center of gravitation. Social value is determined by socially necessary labor. And since at the level of aggregate social reality, total price is equal to total value, values of commodities are determined by the socially necessary labor. Why Samuelson failed to understand? He is looking at just like a perfect neoclassical economist, atomized producer, not production as a social phenomenon.
What is like the value of economics like the Indian uses?
Neoclassical. All governments use neoclassical economics or Keynesian or a mix of it.
What is the difference? What is neoclassical? How does it differ from classical?
Classical is Adam Smith and Ricardo.
And neoclassical, what did it improve on?
Neoclassical improved, no, they made things worse. They took one idea from Adam Smith that market, the hidden hand dynamics, ensures that there is an equilibrium. They take it to another extreme and say that equilibrium is a static equilibrium and there is a smooth and automatic reproduction of system. Adam Smith never said that. So neoclassical, in the sense of all neo things, they generally make it worse. Neo-fascism, worse than fascism. Neo-Marxist, don't even let me start speaking about that.
There's something like postmodern neo-Marxist.
Neo-Marxists are of different kind. All of them are not postmodernists. Most of them are stupid.
One thing, as a response to the Great Depression, we saw Keynesianism.
As a
response to the
depression, yeah, Keynesian.
Now, when OPEC crisis came, we saw it, I think, around 78%, and we saw Reagan, Milton Friedman kind of.
Yeah.
So, what is happening today? I mean, are we continuing Milton Friedman kind of welfare cutting and all those things?
See,
and there is welfare around us.
Yeah, there is, see, these are theorists, right? Theorists play the role of, watchmen for the system. Bourgeoisie as a political class listens to its theorists, but it doesn't follow the textbook of theorists. It acts according to political expediency. Moreover, it is the theorists who theorize the political interests of bourgeoisie rather than political bourgeoisie following the dictates of theorists. So their role is more of a legitimizing, they have a legitimizing function. It is bourgeoisie as a political class which mixes various policies, mainly neoliberal policies, neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics. They will make decisions based on political exigencies. The theorists post festum legitimate it, right? So neoliberalism started before Milton Friedman gave his theory. He only legitimated, gave a theoretical justification to the policies of neoliberalism. Neoliberal policies started even before Milton Friedman could theorize them. So, and Marxist political economy as a scientific political economy, it was always there. We were talking within bourgeois paradigm, there was a period of dominance of neoclassical economics, then there was a Keynesian interregnum, then neoclassical economics came in new avatar. That is happening, but Marxist political economy has been there all along. It has presented it has theorized not the political policies of a particular class. It actually undertook a scientific study of how capitalist system works from a class standpoint, proletarian class standpoint. Why proletarian class standpoint doesn't impede our ability to reach the truth? Because proletariat has no interest in hiding the truth. exploited and oppressed classes, and especially of all the exploited and oppressed classes, proletariat, because it doesn't have any private property, it has nothing to lose, it has an element of universality, and its class interest lies in revealing the truth, not fetishizing the truth, not putting a curtain before the truth. Bourgeoisie, since it is an exploiter and oppressor, of course it has interest in hiding the truth. So that is why Mao said that in a class society, truth has a class character. He's not talking about natural science, like he's not saying that light moves at 3 lakh kilometers per second during capitalism, but in socialism it increases its speed to 4 lakh kilometers per second. He's talking about social class struggle and the truths of social class struggle. So in that sense, Marxist political economy was always there, and from a proletarian class standpoint, that is the class standpoint which propels you to reveal the truth rather than hide the truth. And that is why, due to its class commitment, not because Marx was a genius, of course he was a genius, but he could reach the truth because he was a committed revolutionary, he was a partisan, he was a militant revolutionary. And that is why he could reach that truth. If he was not there, maybe someone else would come with some time lag or some time advance. Cannot be determined by us today, but when the time for that theory comes, sooner or later that theory comes, because theory only reflects the social class struggle. So Marxist political economy was there even during the Great Depression. Henrik Grossman was writing during that time. The classical Marxist political economy represented by Henrik Grossman and many other people. Lenin was there, Bukharin was there. So during the Second World War also, Maurice Dobb was there, Ronald Meek, all these Marxist political who continue. But the academic atmosphere is determined by the upswing or downswing of capitalist system. If capitalist system is in upswing, Marxism is suddenly marginalized. When crisis hits, Marxism again comes into vogue. So, but Marxism has always been there. मुझे लगता है हम लोग मजबूर कर रहे हैं लोगों को. We are forcing people to come up with some question. There are long, awkward silences. Yeah. So you are Comrade Ramakrishnan.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I really do not know all these guys are economists, so I don't have a context here to ask the questions. So just from what you said, I have some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Probably silly.
No question is silly.
That much
Yeah.
as well. So when you said that underconsumption, even Marx proposed something like investments.
Sorry?
Marx proposed, contrary to the other guys, the new investments can lead to capitalist production. Something like that you talked about.
Yes.
So why is it not followed by the capitalists to have it like introduced again and again following Marx? That's one thing. The other question is, you did mention that when you increase the wages, you will also have the rate of production profit increase. So
No.
No? Okay.
No, the increase in wages will always create, because see, workers are producing new value during total labor time, right? Old value is the value of means of production. All the new value added, what the bourgeois economics calls new value added, is produced by living labor. That new value is divided into profit and wages. Given the rate of profit, If the wages increase, profit will decrease because it's the same new value. If the new value itself increases, right, then it is possible to have increasing profit as well as increasing wages, right?
That's the point. So you said they did not consider about the time lag, and if they add the investment and if the wages are increased, I mean, that's what I understood a little bit. Marx proposed that there is this possibility of
Yes.
if you increase the wages, it will be an increase in profitability because of the time lag and
Yes.
you put an investment in the and stuff. So why are capitalists not following Marx to keep it up?
Marx is not saying that if capitalists subjectively decide to increase investment, then the problem will be resolved.
Right.
Marx is saying that if it happens objectively, what are the objective forces which propel the capitalists either to decrease in investment or increase investment is profitability, right? So profitability has a long-term tendency to decline. Why? Because of two competitions. Competition among capitals and competition between capitalist class and working class. Competition among capitals force the capitalists to introduce new machinery, new technology, increase the investment on means of production relative to investment on labor. So investment on machinery and means of production is increasing relative to increase in the investment on labor, but new value is produced by living labor. If in the long run the investment on means of production increases faster than the investment on living labor, then the rate of profit will fall, and it will happen free of the will of capitalists because of the competition, which will compel the capitalists to increase investment on means of production in order to make their production more efficient or decrease the per unit cost so that they can beat their competitor in price competition and capture the larger share of market, right? So it is the objective law of capitalist mode of production which forces the capitalist to increase organic composition of capital. When organic composition of capital, that is capital labor ratio, increases, then rate of profit falls. It is free of will of capitalists. Capitalists cannot say कि यार ये organic composition बढ़ाने की वजह से rate of profit गिर जाता है, बढ़ाऊंगा ही नहीं. I would not. The other capitalist will eat him because he will invest more on machinery, become more efficient and beat him in price competition. So it is like free of will. This is the objective law of capitalism. So Marx says when profitability is increasing, right, when rate of surplus value is increasing faster than the organic composition of capital, then rate of profit will increase. When rate of profit will increase, rate of investment will increase. So decline or increase in the rate of investments by capitalists are not determined by the subjective decisions of capitalists. Subjective decisions of capitalists, on the contrary, are determined the objective laws of capitalist production itself. So they, even if they decide not to modernize, not to increase their investment on means of production, if certain individual capitalists do that, the only option for them will be getting ruined in the competition. So they are obliged, compelled to do this, and this compulsion itself leads to decline in the rate of profit. So it is the objective laws of motion of capitalism, and that is why even if they read Marx and they understand what crisis, in fact Nicolas Sarkozy was caught red-handed reading Capital in 2008. So they were trying to understand the system that they themselves have created, but they don't understand. So वो बहुत तस्वीर चर्चा में आ गई थी कि सरकोजी कैपिटल पढ़ रहा है, वो भी पब्लिक पार्क में बेंच पे बैठ के पढ़ रहा था. तो but class interests dominate. Like some individual capitalist can become Marxist, but if he becomes Marxist, what will he do? I don't know what will he do, but Maybe he will think that कि जब तक सोशलिज्म आता है तब तक धंधा करते हैं, जब सोशलिज्म आ जाएगा तो अपना प्राइवेट मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन हम सोशलाइज कर देंगे. इनफैक्ट वी हैड वन कैपिटलिस्ट फ्रेंड who totally read Capital, understood Marxism, everything. He used to say कि comrade, I understand everything. I understand that capitalism is prone to crisis. Recurrent crises will ultimately lead either to destruction of both warring classes, barbarism, or socialism. But right now I am just doing it. And when the time comes, all of this is सब socialism के लिए है. So either they will talk like that, or I don't know what will they do. But the possibility of functioning capitalist understanding capital is very rare. Why? Because class interests impede your view, impede your capability to understand something. If it goes against your interest, then you just don't want to accept it. You will find counter views. And if you read on a Facebook that Samuelson has discredited Marx completely, refuted it. बस पढ़ने की जरूरत ही नहीं है कैपिटल, ये तो गलत प्रूव हो चुका है. That is why bourgeois system involves in consistent propaganda that Marx तो outdated, outmoded, अच्छे आदमी थे, मजदूरों के बारे में सोचते थे. सैमुएल्सन ने भी लिखा है अपनी बुक में इकोनॉमिक्स में कि one credit that we can't take away from Marx that he was a great sensitive person who thought about working class. But he was a fool. That's what he said. So this is one way of suppressing the truth. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Lastly, then why did Marx say that increasing the rate of investment will somehow reproduce capitalism?
Yeah, whenever the rate of investment will increase, capitalism will thrive. That is true. But the basic point is that rate of profit will fall, and it does fall. It has fallen from 38 to 40% rate of profit during the Industrial Revolution. It has come down to 6%. And since the long recession, dollar gold standard collapse, 3.5% it has never crossed that in the real productive economy. So it is falling. It will repeatedly create destruction, because it leads to a very rough road, but it also breeds creation. Red Hot Chili Peppers. There is a song by Red Hot Chili Peppers, Californication. Yeah. It says that destruction leads to a very rough road, but it also breeds creation. That is the dictum of capitalism, because it cannot give rise to anything new now. So it will destroy and then reset the counter to zero, but all of that happens at a cost of lives of living people, children, workers, women, and that is what also leads to revolutionary situations. So Marx never says कि एकदम inefficient system है capitalism. Marx says that capitalism is a revolutionary mode of production vis-a-vis all previous modes of production. He says it is the most dynamic mode of production in the history of human civilization, and it is the first global mode of production. Because the law of capital is expand or perish. Profit for profit, making money from more money, endlessly. That is the law of capitalism. So it will expand, it will cross national boundaries, it will hegemonize the world. But again, it will meet its own barrier. Capital itself. So Marx was a great admirer of capitalism in some way. So he's talked about Germany and said, in Germany we are as, what did he say? We suffer from the development of capitalism equally as we suffer from the lack of development of capitalism. कि यहाँ तो कैपिटलिज्म भी ठीक से नहीं डेवलप हो रहा है, एक बार ठीक से डेवलप हो जाए तो ठीक है, कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन शार्पन होंगे, चीज़ें साफ दिखाई पड़ेंगी. अभी ये जो सब मिक्सचर चल रहा है, दैट वाज द पीरियड व्हेन जर्मन यूनिफिकेशन वाज गोइंग ऑन एंड स्टिल प्री कैपिटलिस्ट रेमिनेंट्स वर देयर, सब मिक्स वक्त हो रहा था. और डेमोक्रेटिक रेवोल्यूशन, फ्रैंकफर्ट पार्लियामेंट नाकामयाब हो गई, जो वहाँ पर डेमोक्रेटिक रेवोल्यूशन का एक प्रयास हुआ था. तो Marx is talking about that. So he doesn't say that capitalism is not an एकदम बेकार सिस्टम, इसमें तो कुछ है ही नहीं, ये तो एकदम inefficient. He says that it is the most dynamic system till now. But
monopoly capitalism.
Sorry?
The Googles, the Apples, so there's
Yeah.
a consolidation of a monopoly capitalist system wherein they do though they have this increasing rate of profit, they still sustain and then there is a subsistence to the working class where capitalism survives.
I don't get your question.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is, based on this theory that we have, there is always a fall of rate of profit.
Not always.
Yeah, I mean,
Secular tendency.
Yeah.
Long-term tendency of fall of
Right,
rate of
right.
profit. But rate of profit periodically also increases.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what I understood is because as a long-term tendency of fall of rate of profit, the capitalist reproduction is not possible, something like that, right?
No.
That's not the conclusion, is it?
No. Capitalist reproduction is possible under certain conditions.
Right.
But periodically it will meet recurrent crises. So it doesn't mean that it's a very simplistic thing that rate of profit is falling ultimately. That is Rosa Luxemburg's theory based on underconsumptionism. She doesn't talk about rate of profit, but it's a linear way that it is going down and ultimate collapse of. Marx never says that. Marx says that all crises create dual potential. About the monopoly, even what we are talking about, the average rate is the average rate of profit of the system. When there is a crisis, the monopoly capitalist, the big capital, always enriches itself. Why? Because when the rate of profit goes down and the opportunities for profitable investments shrink, the small and medium capitals are destroyed because they can't deal with it and they are swallowed up by the big capital, including monopoly and non-monopoly, big capital. So in all periods of crisis, the biggest capitalists enrich themselves because the small capitalists and intermediate capitalists who pone daam mein, they sell their factories, their means of production, and they are ruined. So they are getting a lot out of crisis. So it is not about the health of individual capitalists, monopoly or big non-monopoly capitalists. It is about the health of the system. And system can collapse even when the richest are becoming richer. See, so monopoly capitalists and big capitalists, they are the biggest gainers during crises. And that is why in the past 15-16 years, the top corporates in all countries, their wealth has grown by many 100%. Right? So that is not the sign of the health of the system. One group in India also thinks like that. In Punjab, Lalkar Pratibadh group. Like, if you want to make somebody dumb, send them to that group. They will come back much dumber because even talking to them makes you dumb. They don't study, they don't understand anything. वो कुछ भी बोलते हैं बस, कुछ भी. They also said that COVID is a conspiracy, COVID is hoax. There is no such thing. COVID वो सर्दी जुकाम है, वो उसको COVID बना दिया और ये कर दिया. तो और ये conspiracy because even during COVID times the richest capitalists became richer. So he said that it's a conspiracy of big capitalists. They did this to sell vaccines and so completely stupid anti-vaxxer conspiracy theory. They were the COVIDiots of India, basically. So they also thought that monopoly capitalists becoming richer is a sign of system's health. In fact, monopoly capitalists getting richer is sign of the bad health of system, capitalist system. Because the average rate of profit is going down, there is a scramble for remaining opportunities of profitable investment. Small and medium capitals are destroyed, unemployment increases, inflation increases, anarchy, uncertainty, insecurity increases. For system, this is going down, not going up.
Yeah, I mean, that part of clear. What I'm trying to understand is because of that huge wealth in the hands of few, are they dumb enough to say, destroy the system that they are enjoying?
Yeah. Capitalist class individually is least bothered about destruction or survival of the system. They become afraid only when the system is about to be destroyed and it is imminent. Then they suddenly realize ki, "Arey, ye kya ho gaya?" That's what happened with capitalists in all countries where workers' revolutions happened. They are not allowed by the system to think in the long term. Again, the key is understanding that capitalism is a competitive system. Secondly, monopoly doesn't mean end of competition. Monopoly end means intensification of competition. Because see, in pre-monopoly period and today, what is different is not that in pre-monopoly period there was competition, today there is no competition. It only means that instead of having multiple magnates of small capital, you have fewer magnates of big capital. So in that sense, competition becomes much more polar and intensified. And even the monopoly of particular industrial corporate houses in certain sectors also break due to various reasons. Marx talks about two reasons in capital. One is family division, what happened with Ambani's. And the other is emergence. For example, Marx says that in any sector where a monopoly has established its hegemony and doing monopoly pricing, etc., small capital cannot enter in that sector, but big capital can. So Airtel cannot be challenged by Aircel, but it can be challenged by Vodafone. Its monopoly can be challenged by Vodafone. So due to emergence of entrance of new or even older monopolies in some sectors which have been monopolized, competition re-emerges. So monopoly is not absence of competition, it is intensification of competition, and that is why all laws valid for competitive system are equally valid for in the monopoly era.
We can formally end the session, and I'd like to thank Comrade Abhinav on behalf of In Defense of Reason and all of you for coming. So, as Abhinav said, that it's important to be equipped with the correct theory of crisis, and equipped in order to actually do some work and try and change the system and the society that we're living in. So, I hope all of you have entered your names in the register. We regularly conduct study circles, discussions, and along with that, all of us are engaged in practical political work as well. Because for us, Marxism is not just a theory or something to learn and understand, but rather to practice and implement in order to bring change.